Hallo, einen wunderschönen Nachmittag. Mein Name ist Cordelia Pollina. Ich bin geschäftsführende Gesellschafterin vom Planungsbüro Catalyst und ich begrüße Sie ganz, ganz herzlich zu dieser Metropolenkonferenz London. Ich freue mich, dass so viele den Weg trotz des schönen Wetters und der Sturmwarnung hier nach Oberschöneweide gefunden haben. Und ich werde jetzt gleich auf Englisch weitersprechen, weil wir haben Gäste aus London. We have guests from London and I really warmly want to welcome you. You traveled far. We are extremely happy to have you here. Und ich möchte auch die Staatssekretärin Ülker Radziwill begrüßen. Auch Sie herzlich willkommen. Ich freue mich, dass Sie da sind und auch alle anderen Redner und Rednerinnen, alle Speaker, die uns noch online zugeschaltet sind. Louise Duggan from London and Tobias Göwert, who's in Hamburg. So, yeah, first of all, I'm really happy that we can have this event, and as we're still within the COVID pandemic, it's not Tobias Göwert who's moderating today because he just caught the virus, so he had to stay in London. I think he's having some tears in his eyes right now because he really wanted to meet you too. We've been planning this for ages. The exhibition has been stopped due to the pandemic. Now we can finally have this event, which is really great, and I'm really happy to see you. I've been following your work for 10, 15 years. I've really been admiring it. It has influenced a lot of my work as well in Berlin. Soon Elke Plate will also join us from the Senate Department. We're always looking at London and trying to implement stuff that you have been doing in London. We're trying to implement that in Berlin. So this is going to be a really fruitful exchange today, and I'm really glad that we can have it in person as a real event. And at the same time, it will be streamed, so people from other places can watch it later on and can also join it. I will stop talking now. I will hand over to Rudolf Spindler, who will say some opening words. I think we have a mix of German and English. He's representing the IV today, and he's a redacteur of the BB 2070 magazine. Rudolf Spindler, please.
Thank you very much, Cordelia. Einen schönen Nachmittag, liebe Gäste, und willkommen zu unserer Konferenz zu den Zentren in Berlin und London. Wir haben ein bisschen Schwierigkeiten im Moment, weil die Zentren hier in der Umgebung komplett dicht sind, was den Verkehr betrifft, weshalb wir auch ein bisschen später angefangen haben. Im Namen des Architekten- und Ingenieurvereins zu Berlin-Brandenburg und seines Vorsitzenden Tobias Nöfer darf ich Sie heute am Nachmittag herzlich zu unserer Veranstaltung begrüßen. Mein besonderer Dank gilt unseren Gästen aus London, und wir freuen uns natürlich auch sehr, dass Sie, Frau Radziwill, Berliner Staatssekretärin für Mieterschutz und Quartiersentwicklung, das Thema ist ja schon sozusagen in Ihrem Titel drin, heute in unserer Mitte sind. Gestatten Sie mir wenige Hinweise, den Kontext unserer Veranstaltung betreffend. Wir befinden uns hier in der Werksporthalle des Behrensbaus, in der vor ein paar Jahrzehnten noch Arbeiter und Angestellte nach getanem Tagwerk am Barren geturnt haben und am Reck geturnt haben. Und wir haben das mittlerweile zu einem ganz guten Medienstudio, sehr professionellen Medienstudio ausgebaut. Die Werksporthalle ist Teil des Industriebauensembles hier an der Spree, das von dem berühmten Architekten Peter Behrens entworfen wurde und zwischen 1915 und 1917, also mitten in der Zeit des Ersten Weltkrieges, hier gebaut wurde. Hier im Osten Berlins existierte vor und nach dem Ersten Weltkrieg eine der wichtigsten städtischen Fabrikquartiere Europas. Der Aufstieg dieses Quartiers ist auf das engste mit dem Aufstieg der AEG verbunden zu einem Elektrokonzern mit Weltgeltung. So war es der Gründer der AEG, Emil Rathenau, der hier in Oberschöneweide das erste Drehstromkraftwerk gebaut hat und das erste Kabelwerk Oberspree bauen ließ, wo alleine in diesem einen Werk 10.000 Arbeiter gearbeitet haben. Hier in der ganzen Gegend natürlich sehr viel mehr. Im mehrgliedrigen Industriebau mit dem 70 Meter hohen quadratischen Turm hier um die Ecke, an der Kamera können Sie das und im Stream können Sie das leider jetzt nicht sehen, wurden erst PKWs gebaut, dann LKWs gebaut, dann später Elektronenröhren, Radargeräte und bis ins Jahr 2005 Bildröhren für Fernsehgeräte. Nach langer Zeit der Unsicherheit, man wusste lange nicht, was wird aus dieser Industriebrache nun werden, hat sich die DAG entschlossen, dieses Gelände hier zu kaufen und macht jetzt hoffentlich eine tolle Entwicklung hier, eine Transformation in ein innovatives und hoffentlich auch geschichtsbewusstes Gewerbestadtquartier der Zukunft. An diesem besonderen Ort der Geschichte und der Zukunft Berlins sind wir vom IV auch mit unserer Ausstellung Unvollendete Metropole, 100 Jahre Städtebau für Groß-Berlin angesiedelt, sozusagen als Zwischennutzer. Mittlerweile haben 30.000 Besucher die Ausstellung gesehen, die auch die Zukunftsvision eines städtebaulichen Ideenwettbewerbs Berlin-Brandenburg 2070 beinhaltet. An diesem Wettbewerb haben Architekten, Landschaftsplaner, Verkehrsexperten aus aller Welt ihre Entwürfe und ihre Ideen für Berlin und Brandenburg konzipiert. Zu diesem Gesamtprojekt gehören auch das Begleitprogramm sozusagen. Ja? Und dieses Begleitprogramm wächst und wächst und wächst. Wir haben 44 Metropolengespräche mittlerweile hinter uns, 18 Städtebaugespräche mit Politikern und Architekten. Wir haben internationale Metropolenkonferenzen schon noch geplant und schon hinter uns, in denen wir über die Herausforderungen der Metropolen sprechen, von Städten wie London, Wien, Moskau, Paris und eben auch Berlin. Zu diesem Gesamtprojekt, von dem ich gerade gesprochen habe, gehören auch der zweibändige Ausstellungskatalog und ein wunderbares Magazin, BB 2070, Magazin für Städtebau und urbanes Leben. Der Katalog ist übrigens auch in englischer Sprache erhältlich. Und wer noch was bestellen möchte, ich bin ja hier auch ein bisschen für die Werbung zuständig, der möge sich bitte beeilen. Es gibt nur noch wenige Restexemplare, die man über die Website der unvollendeten Metropole bestellen kann. Was haben wir vor? Was haben wir gemacht? Wir haben erstmal sehr viele Fragen gestellt. Wie können wir die Metropole der Zukunft gestalten? Wie verhält es sich mit den Grün- und Wasserräumen? Was kann Wohnraum in hoher Qualität, wie kann der geschaffen werden? Wie kommen wir weg von der autogerechten Stadt zu einem neuen Verkehr? Wie wollen wir eigentlich als Menschen hier in dieser Hauptstadtregion wohnen, leben und arbeiten? So lauteten unsere Fragestellungen zuletzt. Und heute kommt eben eine neue Fragestellung hinzu, nämlich die Frage nach den Einkaufsstraßen der Zentren in den Metropolen Berlin und London. Und ich freue mich schon jetzt auf die Diskussion und auf die Antworten, die wir von den Experten bekommen. Aber zunächst einmal möchte ich Sie, lieber Dr. Keck, auf die Bühne bitten hier und Sie bitten, ein bisschen dieses Gelände hier vorzustellen, was Sie machen. Und dem Dr. Keck und seinen Kollegen im Vorstand der DAG haben wir als IV auch zu verdanken, dass wir hier mit unserer Ausstellung zu Gast sein dürfen und das übrigens sehr gerne machen und wir sehr uns freuen über Ihre Gastgeberschaft.
Ganz lieben Dank, Herr Spindler. Auch von mir ein recht herzliches Willkommen an diesem schönen Nachmittag hier. Für die einen vielleicht erneut, für die anderen das erste Mal in Oberschöneweide. Mein Name ist Gregor Keck, ich vertrete den Herrn Spreitzer. Ich bin der Leiter der Kommunikationsabteilung der DIAG-Unternehmensgruppe. Der Spreitzer ist wieder terminlich leider verhindert, sendet aber seine herzlichen Grüße. Ich wurde gebeten, heute das Ganze mal auf Englisch zu versuchen, weil wir auch heute Gäste haben, die des Deutschen nicht so mächtig sind. Insofern entschuldigen Sie es bitte, wenn ich jetzt ins Englische wechsle. Ich werde aber nicht sagen, was Sie, wenn Sie Schöneweide vielleicht das eine oder andere Mal schon besucht haben, nicht kennen. Ladies and Gentlemen, on behalf of DIAG, I welcome you to Berlin, and in your interest, I've been asked to hold my presentation today in English, so please, I will try my best. Welcome to Berlin. As I already said to everyone else, my name is Gregor Keck. I am the head of communications of the DIAG Unternehmensgruppe. The DIAG group, the abbreviation may look a bit strange to your eyes, but it actually means German Real Estate Development Limited Stock Company. We're a project developer, we are an asset developer, an asset manager, and an investment manager. And we bought this building here that surrounds us here. We bought the adjacent industrial zone right behind me in 2019. And as Mr. Spindler already said, we're now trying to develop it in cooperation with the city senate, with the municipality here, and with everyone else surrounding us. I said early on, and maybe to shed a bit of light on the question why we bought this place, why we're trying to develop it, let me explain a little bit about this area here. Early on I said welcome to Berlin. I should rather say welcome to Oberschöneweide. As you know, Berlin 100 years ago was made up of countless various separate entities, municipalities. We've only become a big city 100 years ago in 1920, and this place here, Schöneweide, was far beyond the city limits. It's been an industrial zone already then, but long before that, it was something completely different, and the name is probably reminiscent of that time. Schöneweide means nothing else but beautiful meadows, beautiful pastures. When you look around you, you ask yourself, why is that? Well, very easy. Long ago, in the mid-19th century, this place was lush and green. People from the city already then went out on the weekends and tried to get some quiet, enjoy the greens. There was pubs and inns lining the riverfront, and there was a train. And then slowly, as the Industrial Revolution took up momentum, the Berlin industry needed space. So they came to Schöneweide, to the beautiful meadows, and planted their first, Mr. Spindler said already, their first electricity works here. Companies flocked to this ground, and it quickly transformed into one of the biggest inner-city industrial compounds in the world. The city grew beyond it, beyond its limits, and now we find ourselves in the middle of the city, actually. If you look around you, you find hardly any meadows. Okay, you've got some forests nearby, you've got the water flowing right in front of us, but nothing really reminds us of that 19th century. Schöneweide has undergone a second major transformation, first from the meadows to the industry, then from the industry to dereliction. With the German unification came the end of industry, came the end of 28,000 full-time industrial workplaces. And you have to understand that those workers, they lived here. So the entire city district here plummeted. Yeah, it was one of the, well, look at the 90s, look at history. It was really, really harsh to live here. Very long time, no one really cared for this area. But with Berlin now having found the dynamic of development, where now suddenly all the developers and companies that want to invest here in Berlin look to the outskirts. Now we have enough pressure to develop here, and now suddenly speculation is over. I mean, we bought this place from someone who speculated on a large landfall bin. Buy cheap, sell expensive. What we do here is we develop. We speak to everyone, we look at the structures here, many of them are listed. We look at the whole grounds. We draw up city plans with the municipality, and we include all the zivilgesellschaftlichen, all the representations of the people who live here and all the associations that have an interest in this area. We developed a vision to turn this place into one of the most sustainable city quarters, city business quarters, or high school or Hochschule, university quarters. But also to solve one of the biggest questions of humankind, which is the energy question. We want to offer space for 10 to 15,000 workplaces, but those workplaces need energy. So the first thing we did is we drew up an energy concept based completely on green energy that is sourced here. So we produce energy here locally using water power, using geothermal energy, and using energy from thermal recycling, plus obviously solar power. And we try to get back the idea of the meadows into the city quarter. So we remembered the original face of this site here. It was a green meadow. So we try to bring that back, and we're going to introduce rooftop gardens, just like parks, on top of all the new buildings, so that you can have green meadows again in Schöneweide, in the green meadow area, plus the pubs and inns. So we're going to bring them back. I introduced this concept to many people, many times, and I will do so again in about half an hour outside to a group of students who are visiting the exhibition nearby, next door actually. So please excuse me temporarily. I'll be heading out at about 5 o'clock, and I'll come back hopefully with some of the students at about 6 o'clock, so an hour later. So please don't be offended if I leave in the middle of your talk. Thank you very much. I wish us all a pleasant evening. And Ms. Polina, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Schön. Yeah, I'll make it very short right now. I'm very happy that the Secretary of State for Tenant Protection in the Berlin Senate Department for Urban Development is here, Öka Radziwill, and I'm looking forward to your Grußwort and presentation, which will be in German. Thank you.
Sehr geehrter Herr Spindler, sehr geehrter Herr Dr. Keck, liebe Frau Polina, meine Damen, meine Herren, Ladies and Gentlemen. Ich darf erstmal ganz herzliche Grüße von Frau Karlfeld Ihnen übermitteln. Ms. Karlfeld sent her best regards, and I warmly welcome to all our guests from London. Unfortunately, Ms. Karlfeld, she is unable to attend today. I hope I can present her speech to your satisfaction. Well, I will continue in German, sorry. Ja, meine Damen, meine Herren, unsere Städte unterliegen einem kontinuierlichen Wandel. Und dieser Wandel hat sich in den vergangenen Jahren noch deutlich beschleunigt. Zuzug und wachsender Tourismus, Onlinehandel und der Klimawandel verändern zunehmend das Bild der Städte. Die Covid-19-Pandemie hat diese Entwicklung noch verstärkt. Besonders betroffen sind die städtischen Zentren. Damit unsere Städte und ihre Zentren auch in Zukunft Identifikationsorte für ihre Bewohnerinnen und Bewohner, aber auch attraktive Besuchsziele für unsere Gäste bleiben, müssen wir diesen Wandel entschlossen und gezielt steuern. Die städtischen Zentren sind seit jeher Mittelpunkte dieses sozialen, wirtschaftlichen und kulturellen Lebens in den Metropolen. Ihre Lebendigkeit und Vielfalt auch in Zeiten der Transformation zu erhalten, muss unser oberstes Gebot sein. Ich danke dem AIV, dem Architekten- und Ingenieursverein zu Berlin-Brandenburg, für diese Initiative zu dieser Konferenz. Zu Recht nehmen Sie die Frage nach der Zukunft der Stadtzentren in Metropolen in den Fokus. Gerade vor dem Hintergrund der vielfältigen Herausforderungen ist dies ein eminent wichtiges Thema für die Stadtentwicklung von morgen. Metropolen weltweit und in Europa stehen vor ähnlichen Herausforderungen wie Klimawandel, Demografie und Pandemie. Deshalb ist es wichtig, sich auszutauschen, voneinander zu lernen. Und ich freue mich sehr darüber, dass wir heute die Gelegenheit haben, uns von den Erfahrungen einer anderen europäischen Metropole, von London, inspirieren zu lassen. Erlauben Sie mir jedoch, zunächst einen Blick auf die Besonderheiten der städtischen Struktur Berlins zu werfen. Berlin hat das, was viele Metropolen heute anstreben: eine polyzentrale Struktur. In Berlin gab es noch nie das eine, sondern schon immer viele Zentren, ganz ähnlich wie in London. Das hat Vorteile für die Berlinerinnen und Berliner. Kulturelle und bezirkliche Angebote sowie Läden des täglichen Bedarfs finden sich sehr wohnortnah. Der Einkauf zu Fuß, per Rad oder mit dem öffentlichen Personennahverkehr ist leicht und die Berliner Kieze erhalten durch ihre lebendige Atmosphäre. Die kurzen Wege erhöhen sich nicht nur die Lebensqualität, sie verringern auch klimaschädliche Emissionen und tragen zum Ziel einer klimaneutralen Stadt bei. Der Erhalt der polyzentralen Struktur Berlins und die Sicherung seiner historisch gewachsenen Zentren ist bereits seit über 20 Jahren Kernziel der Berliner Stadtentwicklungsplanung. Diese wichtige Maxime bestimmt auch die Planungen für die Zukunft. Deshalb betreiben wir seit vielen Jahren eine gezielte Zentrenpolitik für heute und für morgen. Wir blicken dabei besonders auf die Stärkung des Einzelhandels, denn seine Entwicklung in den Zentren hat eine Schlüsselfunktion für eine nachhaltige Sicherung ihrer Attraktivität. Mit dem wachsenden Tourismus hat aber auch die Bedeutung der Gastronomie für die Berliner Zentren zugenommen. Sie trägt entscheidend zu Berlins Anziehungskraft bei. Mit interessanten Angeboten in Einzelhandel und Gastronomie wollen wir zukünftig die Besucherfrequenzen in den Stadtzentren noch stärken und halten sie dadurch auch lebendig. In unserem aktuellen Stadtentwicklungsplan Zentren 2030 haben wir uns daher auf konkrete Ziele und Leitlinien verständigt, um die Entwicklung von städtischen Zentren und Einzelhandel in Berlin qualitativ und quantitativ zu steuern. Diese sind zum einen oder erstens Berlin als Metropole weiter zu profilieren, damit die Strahlkraft Berlins erhalten bleibt. Und zweitens, den großflächigen Einzelhandel gezielt in die Zentren lenken, um die vielen Zentren zu stabilisieren. Drittens, eine zielgerichtete räumliche Steuerung des Einzelhandels. Viertens, die Nutzungsmischung in den Zentren stärken und mit Flächenressourcen verantwortungsvoll, nachhaltig und sozial gerecht umgehen. Fünftens, eine möglichst engmaschige Nahversorgung sichern und schließlich sechstens, die Weiterentwicklung von Stadtzentren und Einzelhandelsstandorten zu ermöglichen. Meine Kollegin Elke Plate wird später in der Podiumsdiskussion auf diese Aspekte noch genauer eingehen. Ich möchte Ihnen daher abschließend noch einen neuen Ansatz zur Steuerung der Zentrenentwicklung vorstellen. Als Reaktion auf die Veränderung der Stadtzentren im Zuge der Covid-19-Pandemie haben wir uns die Frage gestellt, wie wir unsere Zentren gegen Krisen widerstandsfähiger machen und sie gleichzeitig als Identifikationsorte, als Versorgungs- und Erlebnisorte auch in Zukunft erhalten zu können. Wir freuen uns deshalb, dass unsere Bewerbung im Förderprogramm des Bundes zur Post-Corona-Stadt mit einem Pilotprojekt zum Kuratieren Erdgeschossmanagement in Zentren und Geschäftsstraßen erfolgreich war. In diesem Projekt wollen wir bis Ende 2023 untersuchen, wie Erdgeschosszonen im Zusammenspiel von öffentlichen und privaten Akteuren zukünftig besser gemanagt werden können. Wir wollen auch wissen, welche anderen sinnvollen Nutzungsmöglichkeiten der Erdgeschosszonen neben dem Einzelhandel denkbar sind und wie lokale Akteure und Netzwerke optimal eingebunden werden können, um Zentren und Geschäftsstraßen zu beleben. Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, Sie sehen, wir sind auf die Veränderung gut vorbereitet, wenn es uns gelingt, unsere Ziele für die Gestaltung der Berliner Stadtzentren umzusetzen, bin ich sicher, dass Berlin auch in Zukunft für die Berlinerinnen und Berliner ein wichtiger Identifikationsort und für seine Gäste ein attraktiver Besuchsziel bleiben wird. Nun aber bin ich gespannt, welche Ansätze London für die Gestaltung seiner Zentren gefunden hat. Ich freue mich auf einen anregenden Austausch, wünsche Ihnen und dieser Veranstaltung gutes Gelingen. Vielen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit. Thanks for your attention.
Vielen Dank, Frau Radziwill. Und we now first of all have Toby from Hamburg Toby used to study architecture in Aachen and Oxford, and while he was in Oxford, he decided to stay in England and then started to work in 2003 at the Architecture and Urbanism Unit founded by Richard Rogers at the Greater London Authority. That was a time of great change in the urban development sphere in London, and he worked in that very interesting unit, which later on became Design for London and is now, as far as I understand it, London Regeneration, where Louise is the head of, who will talk to us afterwards. Toby now came back to Germany in 2019 and is now heading the Department for Urban and Regional Planning in the city of Hamburg. So he came back with all this London knowledge to Germany, and he will give us a short introduction today. Thank you, Toby.
Thank you, Cordelia. I hope you can hear me. Warm welcome to everyone in Berlin and on your screens, with or without COVID. Dear Frau Staatsrätin, dear developers, lieber Rudolf and colleagues, thanks for having us and making this event happen. It's been fun preparing because it allowed us to choreograph a few hand-picked amazing speakers that you will see soon, as well as tell a story of a fascinating little piece of history in the urban planning of London, which is the making of high street places as a strategy with real traction locally to deliver, and a real focus on high quality design too. So when I started as a slightly younger person 20 years ago working for the Mayor of London, I was lucky enough to have Richard Rogers there, who's the chief advisor, as Cordelia just mentioned. And every week on Wednesdays, the team would sit around with him on a round table and plot ideas on how to make London a better place. He had just finished the Urban Task Force with a report that I'm holding up because I just got it out the shelf today and thought, wow, this report has been really significant, because it sort of allowed first the Mayor of London, who was nicknamed Red Ken, to ask Richard Rogers to come and implement the ideas of this report in London and test them out. And one of the ideas in the report that was just showing was it said whether we're talking about mixing users in the same neighborhoods, a mix within our street or urban block, or the vertical mix in a building, good urban design should encourage more people to live near to those services which they require. And that's pretty much what the State Secretary also just set out as a strategy. So nobody would disagree that that phrase is still very relevant today and holds the key to sustainable, mixed and dense urban places that we want to achieve. Another idea in this great report was to shape places in an area-based way involving talented people, how to get people on the client side and on the design side together. A sort of tactical urbanism as we then started implementing, and this is what informed our way of working in the team. Today, at this place, we want to find out and discuss how those two ideas, good mixing and involving talented people relevant to Berlin, but also other European metropolitan areas. We think London has a lot to show, and know that outer centres in Germany face the same big challenges that London was grappling with, perhaps a little earlier due to their slightly more neoliberal policies in London. So Louise will tell you in a minute how our team at the Mayor's office went about reacting to this particular need arising in outer centres, mainly due to retail restructure, lack of investment, lack of social and cultural cohesion, and the demixing which the planning system has been promoting over the decades before, to a place where small high streets and small centres were starting to really suffer and come into focus of our policies. Fiona Scott, who will talk, joined us as an incredibly young, talented designer a few years after I started to research some of this importance on high streets, and really set out some fabulous work, which you'll see today as well. Alpa, who will talk, is a force for good in a very ambitious district in North London. Herself, young designer who would probably not work in this particular role if it wasn't for people like Richard and the GLA pushing this idea that, you've got to get talent into the local councils. You've got to inspire people. And last but not least, then Julian, who's been from the start behind some of the cleverest and most direction-giving projects in this period, helped realize Richard's vision of that compact city for all people. So sadly, Richard died earlier this year, but his gentle and socially focused tactical urbanism lives on and is today just as valid as it was 20 years ago, I'm saying. So I dedicate this afternoon to him. Look forward to hearing the other talks and the discussions from my old companions and colleagues, and hope you enjoy the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. Thank you so much. I hope you can listen. It was very good to hear you talk. And we are now switching to London directly to Louise, who is the head of regeneration at London City Hall at the Greater London Authority. And I'm very much forward looking to her presentation. She will now focus on strategies for the wider city, for the entire city, and we'll narrow it down presentation by presentation and get more closer into different kind of areas. Here it comes. And I'm not seeing Louise at the moment, or I hope she's there.
I'm here. Can you see my screen?
Perfect, Louise. So the floor is yours, and cool.
Thanks very much, Cordelia, and thanks for the invitation. It's always really great to be here and to be prompted to reflect a little bit on our work, because it's quite busy, and you don't get to look back. And from what I've read and what I've heard this afternoon, it sounds like there is a really good alignment between the work that we're doing and the things that you're interested in. So I hope you find this presentation useful. I've tried to structure my presentation today around 3 themes. First of all, how we think about our work. Second of all, around these different modes of delivery. And then finally, how we actually we fuse delivery experience with policy expertise to continue to drive practice and to evolve that those different tactical and strategic urban moves that Toby was talking about. So first of all, just the lenses that we apply in terms of sort of typologies or sectors. We're interested really in the geography of the everyday economy, in how these economies play an important role in shaping places and shaping lives. We're interested in how we take that knowledge and translate it into programs of investment and processes for physical change. This sort of diagram attempts to kind of capture the different ways of working that we have. So some of it's around thought leadership, some of it's about area-based working, some of it's about investment programs, but it all continues to feed each other from one to the next. This is us representing that in a slightly different way. And you can see that it's, 90% of our work is very much this kind of place-based approach, but there are things that we do that go outside of that and go across places. And that makes sense because we're a strategic authority. So just taking a moment to translate our context and hopefully help you to understand why we use the different kind of methods that we use. You can see here the 33 boroughs that make up London. The GLA sits across all of these boroughs and is the strategic authority. So our question is always, where do we add value? How do we cooperate? How do we kind of support borough colleagues to actually go further? What does a central resource, a team, there's about 18 people, 20 people in my team. What do we do across a city of 9 million people to actually boost the capacity that exists at a local level?
Louise, so could you... Sorry to interrupt you. Could you maybe move your microphone a bit further from your face, or there's a...
Sure. Is that better?
That is much better, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. So then if you look after, so we've gone from our 33 boroughs down to our 600 high streets, and this 600 high street number is something that was very much Fiona Scott's work way back in 2010 that got us to this number. These are the high streets that kind of where London's everyday economy happens. And then you go to this, which is a kind of it's a kind of a copy, an evolution of the Abercrombie kind of map of London. And what it is like the psychogeography. These are what people think of when they say certain names. So instead of being a bureaucratic barrier or boundary, this is like the psychogeography of London. And what's really interesting is when you layer the high streets on top of the places, you see that kind of sense of identity, that spatial expression of the economy overlap very strongly. So those brown spots, those places that people know where they mean home when they talk about where they live in London. And in terms of how we work, this is us zooming in. There's cross-borough partnership that colleagues have been supporting for the last kind of 5 or 6 years. Old Kent Road, a very industrial working class road that cuts across New Cross, Lewisham, Southwark, and into parts of Lambeth. It's a place of significant change. And what we're trying to do here is support cross-borough partnership working to make sure that the strategic moves are the right moves. And if you look at this, what that means in terms of partnership working, what you see in dark blue is the governance structures that we have. And what you see in light grey are the 12 different strands of working across this space. And what you're seeing is a working class industrial, high volume kind of arterial route being intensified and hopefully transformed into a more livable and more diverse part of London. At the moment, what that means is, well, a lot of planning applications and a lot of pressure and a lot of kind of pressure on the volumes that we're getting asked to approve. But what the partnership has delivered is a series of documents that support a spatial narrative that understand the political the need for political alignment across different boroughs. And it tries to kind of codify those in a way that all of those partners can work together across the main strategic aims. And it was interesting to hear our colleague from the Senate talk about those different kind of ground floor uses. Because here what you see is a strategic plan that is a strategy for ground floor uses across the Old Kent Road area. And that includes your classic retail, but it also includes ground floor industrial strategies. So this document helps to establish some of the kind of baselines of how you make this a more livable, integrated and intensified place. We've also been delivering projects. So, for example, this is part of how you create space on the Old Kent Road for the community to have conversations about change. We're experimenting with typologies. So this is an extension to a local library that turns it into a workspace and a resource. We're collaborating with people that live on the estates along the Old Kent Road to deliver things like a community-led workspace in underused space within the estate. And what that's resulted in, at least one of the things, is this kind of boost for the Old Kent Road getting almost £10 million. And that's significant for us at the moment in a context where, I mean, they went for Europe first and now they're going for London. There's a really anti-London rhetoric at a national level in the UK at the moment. So we're having to fight for every single penny that we get from central government at the moment. If you look at the next mode, I'm just going to take a moment to speak about one of our particular funds that we've been delivering over the last few years. So this moves from our area-based work into the kind of grant making and coordinating and boosting good innovative delivery across boroughs. The Good Growth Fund grows out of 10 or 15 years of innovation that Toby was referring to, where we had the Outer London Fund, where we had the Mayor's Regeneration Fund. This one was interesting in particular because it was a significant amount of money. It was £75 million. And we were able to do 3 funding call-outs. And that meant we could learn between each round and we could continue to hone and improve it. It also meant that boroughs had some sort of predictability about what would be available and when. We established 3 strategic themes around empowering people, making better places and growing prosperity. Here you just see a map of all of the different places that received funding. And we really targeted places of need and places of change. We also very much expanded the range of people that we worked with. So about just over half of our funding went to borough partners, and the rest went directly to community and charities working in those particular places. And that was a big challenge for us to expand that range of partners and to work effectively. We had over 500 applications and made 80 awards out of that 70 million pounds. And I'm going to do a really quick flick through, just a kind of a roll call, really, of some projects. So this is a performing theatre space, performing theatre school that has relocated to Peckham. It opened its doors in 2018. Mission Kitchen is in an industrial area, and it is right beside one of our key food markets in London, one of our, not a retail, one of the kind of industrial kind of markets. And this is an open workspace offering affordable kitchen space to food startups and SMEs. And it also provides professional training to Londoners from all walks of life. The National Youth Theatre is a really interesting one where it creates opportunities for young local people to access world-class training. What I'm particularly interested in as well is how it's improved a high street frontage in this part of London that has quite a kind of heavily trafficked route. The Blue Market in Bermondsey is a really quick one, just talking about the role of markets, working with market traders and local organisations to reinvigorate this space and deliver something that's delightful and useful. Toynbee Hall, invigorating community infrastructure and civic infrastructure to help local communities. Harrow Arts Centre, which Toby will be familiar with, out on the outer edge of London, reinforcing this sort of cultural offer that's available to people. Kingsley Hall Community Centre, I should have updated pictures of this. This is a really delightful building out in Barking and Dagenham. And two projects that are just coming out of the ground at the moment. So the Africa Centre in Southwark is a really interesting one. It's the redevelopment of a disused office building to house the kind of 21st century Africa Centre. It's a pan-London, pan-African space for the diaspora, the African diaspora in London. And that's going to be opening in a few weeks. And here again, another market, this time out in Newham, a place of significant kind of social need, but actually a really interesting conversation being had with traders about how to prioritise the spend in order to drive social value as well as, you know, invigorating the local economy. And this one here, I think, also resonates with some of the points that I've heard discussed so far today. This is Sutton Works, and it's basically looking at, it's part of a wider strategic regeneration plan for a town centre in outer London. The council has acquired a former department store and is converting it into 3,500 square metres of vacant space to create a multi-use workspace facility that will help to not only give people skills and workspace opportunities, but also to diversify the economy of that high street. So that's a real whistle-stop tour of what we were doing up till the point of the COVID pandemic. And the next section is just going to talk about responses to the COVID pandemic and how we are continuing to use high streets as the kind of armature for understanding how we support communities to build back a fairer and more resilient local economies. So the Mayor, and what's really interesting here, I think, for the conversation today is that what you're seeing here is a very changed funding landscape, a very changed delivery landscape, and a really evolving set of relationships across the different layers of government and anchor institutions in London, which I think is something that we're going to try and, you know, bring forward, because I think it's begun to work much more positively than previously experienced. So the high streets, so there are 9 missions, okay, and there are these cross-cutting principles that underpin all of the missions. The one that I'm going to focus on is High Streets for All. Our High Streets for All mission statement is there. You can see what we're trying to achieve is improve public space, new uses, rethinking how property is used, and having an opportunity to experiment, test, and build partnerships in every single London borough. one of the kind of methodologies that we have for doing that is this High Streets for All challenge. And if you just compare in the previous section I was talking about, the Good Growth Fund, that was £75 million. We had like £4 million for this. So it's a very different context. But essentially what we did was we did a call out to anybody in London to come forward with ideas. Then we worked hand in hand with borough partners to prioritise the ideas in particular places. We gave every borough one partnership, got money to begin to develop the partnership and take time to define what they wanted to achieve. And then they moved on to getting money to deliver a more developed strategy for that place. So it's about partnership building and it's about the development of a strategy, not necessarily the delivery of capital kind of investment. This was a little diagram that was drawn up by Tim Rettler, one of our colleagues, and it just really captures it. It describes that open call, the different exemplar projects. And we've already funded 15 projects so far, and we're in the process of selecting the next kind of 10 to 12 projects that we will support. So just a really quick example of that, in Brent, which is in northwest London, what you have is Church End, which is one of the places in the UK that had the highest proportion of deaths from COVID per capita. This is an underserved community. It's a very mixed community, and it's somewhere where it had been challenging to establish the partnerships needed to collaborate. And what happened was this group called SAFI that you can see at the centre here, are Somali mothers and women group, got together and brought all of these partners together and put them into such context that they were able to work strategically with Brent. They are getting on and delivering now, and it's in this particular place, and there's a whole set of different moves happening which are around creating a youth space, but also creating different opportunities across this high street to test new ways of doing things. Another element of what we're doing through the mission work is this property exchange. So speaking very much to this kind of need to think again about how property needs to be diversified. In the UK, there was an over-reliance on retail. Retail drove everything, and we're having to think very clearly and deeply about how we adapt that, because it's kind of, the fact is, lots of our pensions are invested in the values that are expected to be realised from high street property. So it's not just we can absolutely flip it. But what we can do is we can have a conversation across tenants and across property owners to understand where effective innovation is happening and to mainstream that so that we can drive that sense of a stronger and fairer recovery. And this is something that's being launched this summer, but it's all about facilitating that kind of knowledge exchange. So again, a very different mode for us. Another thing that's been quite interesting over the last 12 months is the role of data and looking at recovery and how you intervene effectively at a borough level to support your local high street. Data was really important. One of the things that we set up was a high street data service. And what this tries to do is it tries to kind of break this kind of situation where you had 33 boroughs paying 33 times for the same data. And so what we did was we clubbed together and we have purchased the data for the whole of the city, and everybody that subscribes to the service can access that data. And I think importantly, not just the data, but the data analysis. So that helps local economic development teams, politicians, the kind of transport teams, the health people, to be getting the same picture about what's happening hour by hour, day by day on their high streets, and understand where they need to intervene and where to target their kind of scarce resources. And this diagram it's not beautiful, but what it's showing you is the change between the first lockdown and the second lockdown. And what you see at the top is, in the top left, is the proportion of high streets, those 600 high streets that were struggling in the first lockdown. And then in the lower half of the diagram, you see the second lockdown, and you see basically the increase of high streets that moved from struggling to adaptable or resilient. So across those, I'm just showing this as a snapshot of one of the outputs. For us at a city level, this demonstrates that there was a resilience that accrued across the 2 lockdowns, and that was a really good thing to know. I'm going to go on now to the final section, and this is about, when I said I would talk about how we draw on the experience of delivery and the policy leads and experts that exist within the GLA, within our team and beyond, to drive practice and innovation, and to try to systematize some of those innovative projects that we see delivered. So what you see here is a diagram that talks about all of the connections. And of course, everyone puts themselves at the center of the universe, but this is just trying to describe that it's not a hierarchical relationship, it's a kind of an integrated relationship. We very much acknowledge the expertise that exists elsewhere in the organization. We seek to leverage that in order to make kind of new discoveries and to kind of push practice. The program is organized around these 6 pillars, and I'm just going to pull focus in particular on 2 pillars today. And one of those is setting standards. So what we did was, through our wonderful cohort of MDAs, two of whom are in the room, we had various pieces of research and topics that we developed over the last 3 or 4 years. And so I think Fiona will be speaking about the High Street and Town Centre adaptive strategies. But what we have is, through our MDAs, we have expert practitioners. We work with policy leads, and we write up this guidance that helps to kind of synthesize an area of research that draws, again, on delivery expertise and policy expertise. The other snapshot I'm going to give you is, again, trying to think about the conversation today and our role as a strategic authority, the building capacity work that we do. So this is a biannual survey of the design resources that exist across 33 London boroughs and the growth pressures in those places. So what it does is it captures people like Alpa, how well her team is resourced up in Waltham Forest, and what the London plan and national government is expecting to be delivered there in terms of housing numbers. So you can kind of very quickly tell if there's a mismatch between the expectation for delivery and the resourcing available locally. And that's helped us to make the case for initiatives like public practice, which Toby mentioned earlier. And that is all about getting talent from places like, people like Julian, people like Alpa, people like Fiona, experts really kind of at the edge of the forefront of practice, and expressing to them the ways that they might be convinced to come into the public sector and use their kind of skills for public good. And that's been a kind of resounding success. It's spun out of the Good Growth by Design programme. It worked at a London level, it expanded to a London and South East England level, and it's just recently received funding from government. So it's a national offer for the next, they're working on a region by region launch, but it's basically becoming a national programme. So that's a massive success for a city that is, constantly being told it doesn't deliver anything for England and the UK, but actually is delivering and driving innovation around how you get the match between growth aspirations and the skills needed to deliver good growth. And that's it from me. So I hope that was useful and interesting. Stop sharing in a minute.
Thank you so much, Louise, for sharing us and showing us the strategic sides of your center development, high street development, and also for giving us a short introduction into these software programs that you have. I think we'll later on highlight them in the discussion, like this public practice program, for example, which I find extremely interesting because, of course, also here in Berlin, but in other small town cities in Germany, in the boroughs of Berlin, we have the problem that sometimes it's not possible to get experts and really aspiring young people into these jobs, and that probably will be an interesting point to talk about with Elke Plate later on, because this is so important to get knowledge and people. Thank you so much, Louise. You can still join us if you wish, but have a great weekend if we don't talk to each other again, and thanks so much for taking the time to be with us. And I'm really happy now to introduce Fiona Scott. She's the co-founder of Gord Scott Architects, sorry for mixing that up. And yeah, Toby and also Louise have related to her a lot already because she actually started this research on high streets in the Architecture and Urbanism unit in London, and in fact really did some groundbreaking work, did amazingly beautiful drawings, which I hope we will see today. And then she founded Gord Scott Architects in 2007, and of course keeps on placing great value on strategic design thinking from very early stages of the design process. She's been working on a lot of projects that have become really like the coin of the London way in terms of dealing with high streets, I would say. And yeah, she's also one of the London Mayor's design advocates, still working with City Hall very closely to support the London evolution. So I'm very curious to hear what you're going to introduce to us. And yeah, we're going more into detail now from the more strategic, very high flight path. We are sort of diving down now, and I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Cordelia, and thank you to the Association of Architects and Engineers for inviting me and us together. It's really fantastic to be here. It's fantastic to be in Berlin. I haven't been for quite some years, and just, well, it's a short trip, but just walking around the city, it just highlights again how important it is to be able to travel and to be in a city in order to be able to bring some of that back to London. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how the evolution of thinking about high streets in London has been a really big part of the work of our practice throughout its life. And it's our 15th anniversary this year, so we're not so young anymore. I am going to talk a bit about some of the strategic stuff because it's stuff that we've been involved in as a practice. So there's been a little bit of overlap with what Louise had been saying. Thank you. But also go into a bit more detail. So this is us. This is our home that we built for ourselves just off a high street in South London. It's just called Tower Bridge Road in Bermondsey. It's not far from London Bridge. And I think, like all Londoners, that's the view from the high street, these streets are really part of the daily lives of how we live and work. And this informs how we see and understand high streets, not just as places of retail and consumption, as is still often the narrative in London, but as places of work and production. And of course, the two are intrinsically linked with each other. So, slightly boring slide, but this is just a hark back to 2008 when my practice started working with the Greater London Authority, with Tobias and others there. And the evolution of outer London urbanism was really only just starting to come into focus. I think previously there had been a lot more effort and thought directed into inner London boroughs and inner London locations, or else the kind of very large, extensive opportunity areas like out east along the Thames. And so in outer London, high streets were a very sort of distinctive form of urbanism with great opportunity, but they were very unloved and very underinvested and kind of very low-key. But really, really important places for people to access local services and goods, employment, transport, manufacture, and all the kind of amenities of daily life. Urbanistically, many of them were kind of connected together quite loosely, and often directly followed routes that had been important connections in London for actually thousands of years. So these are the 6 Roman roads that converged on London thousands of years ago, and a lot of our high streets still follow these routes. So I wanted to talk a bit about some of that early research. I started drawing and kind of measuring urban blocks. This was actually kind of before all the street view stuff. So it was all done on the ground. The sort of blocks that constituted some of these very low-key outer London places. So these drawings were sort of looking at, in quite a low-tech observational way, how places have evolved over time mix of uses in 3 dimensions, this variety of building types and urban form, and how the blocks adapt to different uses, often only with very tiny plots, and the sort of progressive extension and intensification of high street urbanism, as well as the interdependencies between what is actually just the most visible kind of ground floor street frontage and what goes on above and behind in the depth of the block. So, kind of on the basis of that, we were invited to conduct a major study for the London Development Agency, part of the Greater London Authority, alongside University College London, which involved sort of drawing more, but then also defining, as Louise mentioned, defining high streets, more drawings, in a sort of less low-tech way, agglomerating and intersecting data sets and starting to define them by their location, all 600 of them, their sort of connectedness along linear routes. And let's see if I can, yeah, look. So that's a Roman road, and that's a Roman road, for instance. Or alternatively, how they sort of spread out from kind of more standalone town centres. And so we were starting to, that kind of data, the data-driven side of it, helped us to understand that, you know, in outer London, there were more than half of jobs and businesses were on high streets, and 40% of Londoners live within 200 metres of a high street. And I think there was the part of the aim of this study was to enhance the sort of lexicon of language and the understanding of high streets and promote their value, that they really are the life of the city. And that somehow along, just in these very kind of thin crusts, almost all of London's mixed use was and jobs and economy was condensed, and that zone was actually defined later as 200 metres out either side of the high street. So I guess the aim of the study had been to inspire and to inform, but as well to build a case for investment, which a lot of the stuff that Louise just talked about sort of grew up from, but a case for investment around their economic value. But I think for us, the more time we spent in these places, it was really implicit in the research that there was a huge social value and environmental value which high streets support. And I think, so alongside the work of the GLA and Toby and others at the time, this really cemented high streets as an important organising structure for growth in London. So alongside that research, we were also doing projects on high streets. This is Cricklewood, which Julian will well recognise because he also did some really great work here. But this just shows one of the parades of a fairly typical high street in northwest London, also along a Roman road, in fact. And this was a project that was part funded and guided by the Greater London Authority, and one of the earlier projects in an approach to investment in buildings and in businesses that weren't necessarily in public ownership themselves, but where that investment was for public good. And so this was about engaging with businesses and with building owners to upgrade buildings and frontages and to work on signage and identity alongside graphic designers, online and offline as well, and also to work with other partners to provide training for small businesses and telling the stories of small businesses along the high street with photography and narrative and exhibitions, and also devising a series of events in high street and the public spaces around it, around the idea of a mobile town hall. And this was an installation that was also devised by one of our collaborators that travelled up and down the high street and hosted a series of events over a summer. So we also did our first public building. So this was a public toilet, solar powered and using rainwater on the high street. And this is another little high street project, Tottenham Public Room. So this was a pavilion that brought life to a disused car park on a high street and made a community room. It was intended to be there for about 3 months, and it's still there, sort of 10 or 11 years later. So that's the way. I mean, temporary uses often have the reason you make them carries on. They have a reason for being. And then this is a project that's quite neatly encapsulates a lot of those kind of earlier ambitions to harness and provide a space for community purpose and energy on the high street. So this is Central Parade, and this is an Alpers patch in Walthamstow in northeast London. And so this is a lovely, quirky, existing council-owned building on the corner of a high street with a corner unit that used to be a bank, and it was later council offices and social housing above. And the project was for some, pretty modestly low-budget interventions to convert the ground floor and the basement into creative and cultural hub. So it was, retail incubator units of different sizes, co-working space, music rehearsal studios, a bakery and cafe that, does workshops. And I think, this is a formula that's reasonably well recognized now, but it was a really successful project and successful enough for the borough to want to extend it. So this is the back of the building. This is the kind of condition that you often find behind the high street. So the council wanted to build more housing there, intensifying town centre, of course, but also to extend some of those ground floor uses across a shared mews into some more ground floor units across there. And it's, I think there's obviously a very complex negotiation of overlapping priorities in places like this, from play to servicing for the shops and the commercial units, servicing for homes, bins and bikes, and secure access to homes above. And I think this addresses some very typical conditions and issues in those very busy, contested spaces, and it takes a lot of care and attention and as well ambition from the borough to resolve it in a positive way. So that's on site now. We're quite excited to see that coming to completion. So then back again to this research, and almost 10 years after the first research project, we embarked on a guidance document for the mayor that Louise talked about. And this was interesting because things had moved on a lot in that decade, and there was a fundamentally clearer understanding by that point that high streets weren't just about ground floors and sort of street frontages, but that were an urban form with considerable depth, but also that they were an ecosystem. So this is, driven by the creation of all these different types of value, and economic value, commercial value, social value, and environmental value, and the high street ecosystem kind of encapsulates all of this. And so the aim of this guidance is to set out how to make the most of these high street places as London is growing. And as well to restate the case for investment with an emphasis on creating public value and on social and economic inclusion, clear mayoral priorities. So we work very closely with the 10 of the local authority boroughs to understand primarily what good things they were already doing, and there was a lot of good stuff that was already happening, and it's just how to bring all of this together. And then to push some of these ideas further and make these in some case study examples. And so out of these came 10 clear statements of intent, and each one of these was linked to a specific high street, so it was kind of illustrative. Things like using data insight to support businesses on the high street, enabling a flourishing culture for work on the high street, making the high street a model for sustainable living and public well-being. So I'm going to, this is going back to Louise's example, this is Old Kent Road, and it's good to see that this example was able to help support their funding bid, but also the point is that it's something that's transferable and translatable to other high streets across London. So it's an existing South London high street where there's a lot of big development that's happening quite quickly by different landowners and different developers, and driven very much by housing delivery without a particularly clear sense of what activity could or should be supported at street level. So we looked at how to build on what already exists, to plan for a successful mix of uses. And this is, again, the diagram that Louise showed, but just to sort of unpick it a bit. In short, the proposition was to create the idea of a ground floor strategy, which sounds kind of perfectly common sense, but hasn't been being done at all. And this is something that builds on research and evidence and existing employment and businesses in the local area and a market review. So it's about comprehensively assessing the need and the demand from a socioeconomic perspective as well, and then setting out an accountable approach, and an approach that's possible to measure and evaluate, to the mix of scale and the mix of uses that should be accommodated on the high street. And so that's really taking a hyper-local socioeconomic as well as market factors into account in that kind of decision-making process. And so this leads to 3 components of guidance: so urban design and streetscape, unit design, which involves depth and height and servicing, and the control, management and stewardship of properties. And I guess this is, I think Louise had a slightly nicer slide, but the point is that the guidance is accessible and it sits alongside these other mayoral documents, but it's also intended to be used by all different types of stakeholders. So it's kind of illustrated with lots of examples and PDFs with clickable links so that it's accessible for people in the public sector, people in the private sector, and community organisations as well. So part 2 of interventions, where we are now, and this presentation gets a bit looser because this is stuff that we're very much in the middle of right now. I think in the public sector we have seen and we have witnessed a lot of care and collaborative working and kind of weaving together of priorities to create equitable outcomes, despite, as Louise has already alluded to, some very significant funding challenges. But in the private sector, I think we are seeing a rapid progress in thinking within certain strands of certain organisations, but there are still very big projects that are moving ahead very quickly, and with this real political and commercial pressure to build more housing in town centres and on high streets, obviously where it's close to amenities and services and transport, and rightly so. But I think, so we're seeing emerging a scale of buildings and an intensity of living in high street and town centre places, and consequently urban form and block typologies that are quite new to London and not fully tested yet. And, I think so now as a practice of about 30 people, we, having started out doing quite involved kind of ground up work and really thinking about not just what cities are, but what they do and how they do it, we're sort of trying to bring some of that to some of the larger scale developments that are happening in London. So the sorts of places we're working, some of them are existing town centres where there is already a great deal of social value and sort of social capital that you're working with. Areas of large-scale change, like around Wembley Stadium, and places of future potential, like out east in the Docklands. And I think what we're finding is that the kind of language that's being used to describe these sorts of developments is, in places where it's about kind of creating new high streets or adding to existing high streets, the development is sort of described as residential-led mixed use. And I've even heard it described as, on numerous occasions, as housing skinned with retail. So that is obviously the language of real estate, not the language of urbanism. But I find it quite revealing about priorities, because they're sort of widely used terms. And they miss the richness of what makes London's high streets and London incredible. So I think about London's traditional urban blocks, where you have frontage and you have permeability through that frontage to yards and alleys and gardens that support a range of residential businesses and services. And we have used to have, and we still do in traditional parts of London, permeable blocks that are made up of lots of different buildings. Whereas I think what we're seeing now is that buildings are almost the scale of a whole block. You know, that's quite standard now, where the ground floor either becomes, like number one, where it's almost all kind of high-value prime frontage, or, like number two, it's really just a very thin veneer beyond the sort of residential servicing elements. And there is so much housing above that the amount of residential servicing leaves very little for anything else. Bins and bikes and parking, all this. So obviously we can't turn back the clock on economic change, but I think that this reveals what are some unresolved issues of spatial and economic hierarchy if we want to build socially and economically resilient cities. So I think, you know, in this system of development, where are the spaces for businesses with lower economic capital, or for water drainage and ecology, or for social life, for children and play, but also in terms of the actual non-residential uses that are supported. Who should decide what occupants and what uses are appropriate in an area, and who ultimately are these developments for? Who do they benefit? So what are we doing about this? We are starting to work with some quite big landowners and developers, and just kind of trying to scratch the surface of these questions in the context of kind of the fast pace of development and commercial realities of the sort of landscape of real estate in London. So Julian will recognise this as well. These are some of the questions that have been asked in Finchley in northwest London. So this is currently a shopping centre that sits, shopping centre and parking and sort of other big box retail that sits between two high streets of Finchley Road and West End Lane. And we've been appointed, so these are two quite differently characterised, quite different high streets with different characteristics. We've been appointed for an interim placemaking strategy, which sort of sits alongside the master plan. And so this sets out a strategy to lay the foundations for strong connections between people and place, and carve out space and build networks before and during the construction of built form. So setting out in detail a participatory approach to what and how you can build quite intricately from the ground up at the same time as the master plan and the building construction happens from the top down. And so this has just gone into planning. We've also been brought on board by Argent Related in Brent Cross to help them quite rapidly review their approach to developing a new high street as times kind of and the economic landscape shifts quite rapidly. And so this is a project that's been underway for nearly a decade, and it obviously has to be adaptable because things change during that time. But it's started to be built out now. And our brief has been both very broad to basically reappraise what this high street is, but also very detailed about quite particular things about streetscape and frontage, and so jumping in between those scales. And this work is really only just beginning, and the most very sort of urgent bit in terms of the programme is to develop guidance for thresholds and frontages of plots that are already coming out of the ground. So we're revisiting what makes an adaptable commercial street in London and seeking to translate that to bring some of those qualities to a new, much denser type of urbanism. And we're looking at frontages and their depth, their relative openness or closedness, shallowness and depth, trying to get away from the ubiquity of floor-to-ceiling glass. And we're also defining types of parade and variation along a street. So primary parade with its big awnings, secondary that's kind of much more low-key, and then the set-piece building where there's a kind of unifying autonomy. And as well, significant corners. That is something that is so important in your wayfinding and reading, and sort of intuitive reading and navigation of the street, but it's sort of very overlooked in these types of developments. So what we want is what we want to avoid is the sort of lack of clarity and uniformity that we see in some other more recent developments, where there are quite confusing visual cues as to what is going on, what is commercial, and what might be kind of residential entrances, where there's very little vertical articulation between the street and the homes above. And what we want is hierarchy and rhythm and integration and authenticity. But we're not talking about pastiche or copying, bits and bobs from a bygone era, but we want contemporary design and materiality and space for tenant individuality, which is really about allowing for that really all-important layering of a different order to be brought in, not by the architect. And I think it's very clear so far from what we have seen is that when individual plots in a master plan come together, and they've been quite dominated by the requirements of the homes or offices above, there needs to be a much more detailed attention to the experience of the whole street in order to kind of push against that and kind of bring the street back into focus. And I think it's probably worth saying that in a lot of these developments, the designers and architects who are sort of involved in them are often coming from residential development primarily. And so it's just ultimately the street becomes quite left over. So these are very early days, really, in being able to explore these themes with a commercial developer, but I'm really quite excited to see where this can go when we start to look more holistically at typology as well. And I thought that I would finish looking into the future. This is one of our biggest projects that's really only just started for Lend-Lease, so that's obviously a big international development and construction company. And so this is in one of those new places out along the Thames to the east in the Docklands, Silvertown Quays. So in the right of the image is Millennium Mills, which is a huge derelict factory that's going to be the centrepiece for the development. And Silo D, the white building on the left, it's a historic industrial building. And we're designing 2 of the urban blocks that form part of a new high street called Silvertown Way, and it runs between Millennium Mills and Silo D. We're working within really very tight commercial constraints and working very hard to kind of pull back the blocks and make inclusive spaces on the high street, and as well working at the boundary of the existing neighbourhood to the west, trying to support social integration and play. And looking here at the kind of set-piece building type that sits opposite the historic Silo D. And I think, it's not like a traditional London high street, but I'm hoping that working somehow in this space between the realities of commercial development in London and future research, possibly with the GLA, the Greater London Authority, or with other landowners and developers, that we'll be able to explore and develop these typologies more and, carefully test them and unlock better ways of making dense residential blocks that also support a socially and economically resilient city and that make and keep London as special as it is. So, thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Fiona. That was very, very inspiring and most amazing images and a great look into the future of your work and into the past. Thank you so much. You mentioned one point which I find particularly interesting, which is that it is really important to also look at the outer city and not just concentrate on the city centers. We also tend to do that in Berlin and in many cities in Europe where we have these historic centers which give us a lot of tasks as planners. But of course, then we have huge spaces where, for example, in Berlin, 2/3 of the population live and which are often neglected. So the next speaker, which I want to introduce now to you, is in one of these outer London boroughs, and I find that extremely interesting that we get to see what you are doing. This is Alpa Dipana. She's the head of strategic planning and design at Waltham Forest. I'm sure you will show us where that is. Alpa is an architect and an artist, and She was in one of these programs that Louise and also Toby mentioned earlier on, and maybe you will also talk about that brought a young talent into this neighborhood and borough. So your work is very interesting for us from different point of views, and I'm very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Cordelia. So thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Alpa Depani. I am Head of Strategic Planning and Design at Waltham Forest Council. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you and to speak about some of the work that we're doing in Waltham Forest. So firstly, just to say, I am an architect by background, and I moved into working into the public sector through public practice, which has been mentioned a few times, and which, as Louise mentioned, came out of the Good Growth Programme, the Mayor's Good Growth Programme. And public practice was established in 2018 to provide routes for built environment professionals from private to public sector to improve the quality and equality of everyday places, or as Louise and Toby mentioned, to bring talent into the public sector, but I'm too modest to put it that way. But it's through public practice that I joined Waltham Forest Council. So where is Waltham Forest? It is a northeast borough. It is technically speaking an outer London borough, but it's quite unusual in that it's this sort of thin slice of a borough which touches kind of the inner London, but also extends all the way out to the city's boundary. And that's reflected in the character. So it's more urban towards the south, and it's more suburban as you travel north. And there are sort of broadly three main character areas. So there's Leyton and Leytonstone to the south, which I should be able to, and Walthamstow, which is sort of the centre, but really it's considered kind of the south of the borough as well. And Chingford to the north, which is much more suburban in character. And you can also see the defined kind of landscape boundaries to the borough. So there's the blue and green boundary of the Lee Valley to the west and the reservoirs, and the green boundary of Epping Forest, which runs all the way along the eastern boundary and up to the north. And on the other map, you can see the borough's town centres, so including the principal town centre of Walthamstow, which is the darker colour. And when I joined the council 3 years ago, a lot of the focus was around Walthamstow town centre, and also the focus had been on pioneering efforts to upgrade the street and road network, to prioritise pedestrians and cyclists, and to tackle issues around road safety and air quality and public health. And this was initially funded in 2013 by Transport for London under the Millie Holland scheme, but it's continued and it's expanded across the borough, and it's been a huge success. It's demonstrably improved air quality and led to a huge uptake in cycling. And the image on the right, which some of you may have seen before, this is Orford Road in Walthamstow Village, which previously had through traffic running through it. And when the council first proposed pedestrianise it, there was a huge amount of opposition to it, actually, and particularly concerns that it would impact local business. But in fact, after the street was pedestrianised, the retail vacancy rate went down, and it's been a huge success. The amount of footfall has increased, and it's become a really lively centre to the village. So this is the sort of context of when I joined the council, because the success of this initiative, which is ongoing, has allowed the council to be really bold in foregrounding public realm and connectivity. And because thinking about public realm and connectivity necessarily involves looking beyond the red line boundary, I think the success of this has also provided a bigger catalyst for taking a more area-based, as opposed to a previously quite piecemeal approach to development across the borough. So we're thinking and looking a lot more cohesively across land ownerships and site boundaries. And this more holistic area-based approach has been supported by an organisational restructure. Sorry, it's a super ugly graphic, but it does the job. It's a very local authority kind of graphic. But it integrates the sort of previously separated functions of planning policy, design, conservation, trees, and also planning infrastructure into a much larger place and design team where we can better mix skills and experience. And our team is working much more closely. So the place and design team is the kind of peachy, this guy here. And this is how we input across the life of development projects. So our team is working much more closely with other teams across the Directorate, including area regeneration and development management, and feeding in throughout the development cycle. And again, looking to embed a mix of skills on the projects that we take forward. So I wanted to take you through an example of this area-based approach, which was steered by a project team that was made up of colleagues from across the team, so from my place and design team, but also area regeneration and development management. And this is the Leytonstone Town Centre framework, which seeks to provide a long-term vision that is underpinned by spatial and socio-economic and qualitative analysis of the existing town centre. Of the existing town centre. And Leytonstone is the second largest town centre in the borough. It's really well connected in terms of public transport, and it's very close to green infrastructure, which you can see of Epping Forest and Wanstead Flats. So, sorry, down here, Wanstead Flats. Sorry. But so it has this green infrastructure, but it's also quite disconnected because of this big A road that runs just sort of here along the top, and at a big roundabout as well. And it has quite a fine-grained sort of villagey kind of character, and it has a tube station that means it's very well connected, that it's quite well integrated into the townscape, and a very defined historic high street that's got a number of heritage assets, and a mix of small businesses that are in good condition, and a relatively low vacancy rate as well. And in terms of the existing challenges, I mean, it has some larger retail that is quite disconnected, so you can see some of those bigger retail blocks that sort of erode the grain of the high street, and some issues with connectivity. So as I mentioned, the A12, which runs across the top, and then this big roundabout up here. So as well as establishing the challenges and the opportunities of the townscape and urban fabric, this framework was underpinned by very detailed socioeconomic and demographic data. So I'll give you some of the headlines. It's a relatively young town centre, so the average age is 33 compared to 35 for the whole of the borough. It's very diverse. So over half of Leytonstone's population are non-white European. Though the population is more skilled than the borough average, young people are disproportionately affected by unemployment and access to good work opportunities. And the area has had a really steep increase in house prices. And a high proportion of residents live in flats or shared accommodation, so there's a really high population density. So all of that early research, socio-economic research, the sort of challenges and opportunities, led to identifying 8 guiding principles for Leytonstone, which are about providing new homes, providing an upgraded high street and well-connected public realm, which celebrates Leytonstone's historic assets, and which supports local skills and employment and responds to the young average population as well. And then those principles were used to define a 15-year vision for the town centre that's made up of long and short-term interventions. And it's also underpinned by a public framework, which was developed by Julian and East, to Julian's drawings, which seeks to address the issue of connectivity and stitching together new developments and improving the streets and public spaces. And that public realm framework, it understands on a larger scale how the town centre sits at an intersection of this long green corridor, but zooms into the detail of identifying how to make improvements. So, for example, by animating the side streets along this main high street. And this framework also identifies short-term opportunities for enhancement. So one of which is in the centre of the high street, which is Leytonstone Library, to give it a more active civic function. So this is a costed proposal for renovation for the library to allow it to become a civic room and a venue for community events and activities. And then this framework also looks at the longer term. So it identifies the potential development sites. And for each one of these, it goes into considerable amount of detail about placemaking principles, some testing of height and massing, and importantly, some viability information as well, to gauge the amount of affordable homes that each site can deliver. Because really, if the proposals are not deliverable, then it's a kind of pointless exercise. So I wanted to go into detail a bit more on one of these development sites, which is Church Lane Car Park, which is a council-owned site. It's a very long, thin site. It's currently a very underused car park, and it's bounded by the A12, which you can see on the left-hand side, to the east. And it's very close to the tube station. So the tube station is just up here, really. And so in terms of placemaking principles, there's this hostile boundary that I've mentioned, but there's also mature green trees, there's the opportunity of enhanced public realm that connects to the station, which, as I mentioned, is just a bit further north. And there is also an existing community garden to the south and down here, and a multi-use game space here as well, which we want to retain as part of the development of this site. So again, this framework goes into some quite high-level massing and layout testing, as well as viability testing, which was really helpful in refining the brief, which we then gave to 60 Bricks, which is the council's development company, and informing the design discussions and expectations now that the scheme has progressed to pre-planning application stage. So these are some images of the current proposal, which is in planning at the moment, and we feel it responds quite well to the placemaking principles that were established by the framework, as well as the broader 8 guiding principles for Leytonstone. And it's mostly residential, but with some community function along the ground floor, leading up to an enhanced public space, which, as I mentioned, leads up to the tube station. So now I'm going to take a little bit of a detour as I come to the end of my presentation. So, sorry, this is another image from Church Lane. But this is an image from a different proposal elsewhere in the borough by a different development team. And at face value, these images look quite similar in terms of aesthetics, but actually they're really quite different. So in these images, you see the kinds of people that you would actually see if you walked around these streets. There are children. There are some older people. There are people that are not white. And in these ones, everyone looks the same age. They're wearing a certain type of fashion, and everyone is white. And this is more than a presentation issue. It's setting forth an aspiration for an area, for a development in a borough that is nearly 60% non-white. And it's setting out something actually quite exclusionary. And it's something that I had to point out to the applicant team because they hadn't noticed this. So my point really is that we can't really hope to plan for diverse, well-integrated, equitable places that reflect existing communities if the people doing that planning are not diverse or representative of those communities either. So the acknowledgement of that led me to write this diversity pledge for the council, which asks development teams that engage with us to consider the makeup of the teams that they bring to discussions with us. And that pledge has now been incorporated into our planning performance agreements for planning applications. So this is a document between the council and applicant teams which sets out the process for bringing a project through the planning process. And, you know, obviously we can't really change the hiring practices of architects and developers and other consultants that we engage with, but we can make them feel uncomfortable about consistently bringing all white male teams to their meetings because it's a problem. And the problem then becomes realised in the way we start to design our town centres. So this is something that I have been talking about and try to promote more broadly, and it's why I'm mentioning it again to you here, because we need mix in cities, but we also need mix amongst those who are stewarding the shape of those cities as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Alpa, and especially showing us this very important initiative of yours that definitely is a subject which is not, or which should be more on our table in Germany, in Berlin as well. And I think another point where maybe Berlin, Germany could learn a lot from London. But yeah, thanks for also this very inspiring presentation. And before we take a break, we have one more. We have Julian Lewis, and I'm also very, very happy to have you here. Julian is a co-founder of East Architects, and yeah, you've seen some of his drawings already because his practice is very active all over London, but also in other parts of Europe. He's been an architect's office which brings in lots of ideas for the town centers and for projects all over London. Julian is also one of the mayor of London's design advocates, advising Sadiq Khan at the moment on the Growth Manifesto. And of course, he's also teaching a lot, as all of the other presentators we had today, at various universities, for example, in Mendrisio in Switzerland and in Cambridge. And yeah, Julian, you have also a lot of experience in many projects to show us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to start my timer, otherwise I'm going to lose track of time. So I'm Julian Lewis. I'm director of a practice called East. We're architects, but we somehow have taken a perspective on the city right from the beginning that is interested in places. So very interested in talking about that today. I'm going to show you a few projects, all of which have to do with an interest in public space, showing some examples of what public spaces do. It's very nice to follow actually these two presentations just now because I feel kind of in good company with the kind of discussions about, and you can see it's a kind of discussion that's about looking for something. We're constantly trying to find ways to live in the city. And that's one of the things that makes the job exciting, actually, because the learning curve keeps being quite steep. You never quite get it. And so we've talked a lot, I've heard a lot about today and generally about ways to do this, and there are some incredibly useful kind of tables and systems and checklists and evidence, and I think that's absolutely crucial. But I think maybe one thing I want to talk about a little bit today is a little bit connected to the senses and imagination. And all of you and all of us make cities, right? So we have to collaborate. We're all doing it together. And it's very nice when you get a chance to talk about design to actually share ideas. So this next, I'll do it, yeah, got to do it. Yeah, okay. So, George Perek, do you know him? He's someone we really like. He looks very carefully at places. Describe your street, describe another street, compare. Make an inventory of your pockets, of your bag. Ask yourself about the provenance, the use. What will become of each of the objects you take out? Question your teaspoons. What is there under your wallpaper? So he's looking at something incredibly familiar, almost absurd, but actually that's how we felt on one of the first projects we worked on in Borough High Street. Walking up and down a street when a street is a project is incredibly exciting because you think, well, I know this, but actually I don't know any of it. And this image here has a kind of, it's a bit like a Bruegel, I think, kind of, sort of, if I squint. You know, it's got a girl riding a bike, it's got people walking, it's under construction, it's got roads, it's got historic alleyways, and we really loved the idea that actually some of this is, a lot of this is already there, our project was already there, and a lot of what we did falls into the background. And so we kind of began to get clearer about what it means to make a project that is splicing in. You make a good spatial judgment about when to stop making one material and start another one. And also this idea of, how, as designers, how do you choose where things go? You can't really choose where traffic lights go because they go here, right? The cars make sure you have to put it here. But here we could decide to make a piece of granite extra big, and we could celebrate the difficult proximity between cars and people. And we can name things like the kind of old King's Head, which were places hundreds of years old, which were there before many of the buildings. And so there's a kind of interest in identity and time and layers of history. This point you're making about the unfinished metropolis, I think, is really interesting, because places are never finished. They keep going, but they have states of, if you like, credible capacity. They achieve moments of believability. It's like, now it's working. And then something changes, and then you've got to get it to work again. When we made these terrazzo mats with the names in, people were really worried because they thought the shops would change and the names would change. Actually, we liked the fact that time changes. And then, of course, you make a drawing about the public realm. It's really important what drawings you make because they show your intentions. And this is a student's drawing in Sao Paulo where we took the students. And this was a kind of walking drawing. And that shows an intentionality about experience, not just a physical state, but a kind of moving. And this project in Wood Street, which is in Waltham Forest, was a project we worked on. We kind of made this high street drawing to remind ourselves that although the budgets were limited and a lot of aspects of the projects were different, the whole thing is held together in a street. So in a way, it's like going to the detail. And although this is a little way away, this is a street which is nearby. I wanted to show this because it was a very productive thing to do. It was a shop that wasn't really used, wasn't happening, so we put a little bit of money into doing it up, and you had some fairly important political discussions in there, which led to enthusiasm, which led to projects being propelled forward. And there was a lot of people involved in these projects. So here we're working with an artist, lots of artists, in fact, calling a parade. Fiona mentioned the word parade. It's a parade. It's a great name. It's like you're marching past it. But also the shop fronts. Not much money going to these shop fronts, and you have to sometimes get a little bit of match funding or not. But there's an incredible power to talking with shop owners and shopkeepers about how their shop fronts work. And then Alfred Hitchcock was born in the area, and there's a missing film, apparently. I don't know if it's true anymore. I sort of tell myself this, and I think I didn't check this, but I think one of his films went missing. And so we, working with artists like Verity, Jane Keefe, tried to rediscover the missing film, projected the film on the wall, shadow play, public space where you didn't think there was a public space. Then afterwards you make the wall have all of the businesses in the high street, and you celebrate what's hidden from view. Because a lot, as Fiona pointed out, a lot of what's making the high street work is not really seen very easily. And I think when people see people do things, it makes places work. A lot of community engagement. The word consultation can sound a bit chunky sometimes. Community engagement sounds a bit more hands-on. This was before drones. We asked local people what they wanted to do in Wood Street, and we made a balloon with a camera on it. And then there was this sort of celebratory activity and this kind of one-to-one testing of where things went, and we made this space. What's nice about this space, which is a town square, is that it had two types of play space, providing the boundaries. And again, Fiona mentioned kind of thresholds, and I think this is really interesting. So the thresholds, or you could say the boundaries, are useful. So on the right, you have older children over here, and then on the left, you have younger children. And of course, lots of people think that play is just a noisy inconvenience in high streets, but actually, and they try to shove it to one side. What's lovely about this, I think, is that the play was right in the middle. And it's a little bit provocative to do that because, adults and children, it's all impossible. But actually, when everything's in view, it's all good, I think. What's also nice, I think, was there's this difficult backs of gardens, of the residential, the strip of housing. You can see some housing there, shops below. What we did was made another layer so that there's this kind of play echo of the skyline. So it's like a little skyline, a play skyline. And so you have these kind of boundaries which make urban proximity, what Toby referred to earlier about this proximity. It's like rubbing up together of uses in spatial proximity is really important to get right. It's quite difficult to get right. Often it's the hardest bits. It's the ugly bits. It's the bits which look most unpromising, which seem to have the most opportunity for radical change. I think that's worth thinking about. Another high street we worked on, Wood Green, it's kind of 3 kilometres long. Again, there are strategies about it. There are things which have to do with cars, parking, lighting, bins, clutter, all of the generic things that everyone wants to look at. And then you have the kind of place-specific things, the kind of things you would never do anywhere else. And we're always really interested in finding out what the balance is. And here, for example, there was a library, a lovely modern library, but quite dilapidated. So we clad it, we made a sign, we reused some materials to make the space, and it's quite nice. Actually, Muff now, I don't know if you know Muff, they're a really good practice. They're doing another layer on top of this, and they're kind of making this better, even better, I should say. It was all right. And so there is this kind of ongoing kind of process of people getting, you know, there is a thing about inspiring, I don't like the word inspiring, but encouraging people by doing things with a little bit of money that then get people thinking, this could work, maybe we could do this as well. And so I think there is an argument for the city being a kind of its own spokesperson, place. And then, again, you know, you saw some Fiona's work, shop fronts, this time with some funny like a big melon as a sign. It's a fantastic street to eat food in. And then a thing like a beetle farm, which is also a fence, which is also a sign, because the vicar wanted to upgrade the boundary, and so we could scope that bit of the project as a kind of positive corner. Significant corners, you heard that earlier. You know, this was a fantastic pub, quite dilapidated. What we did was we, with Studio Decca, overlaid some lighting, like a kind of lacy armature of jewellery almost. And then we took the Victorian architecture and took an interest in the pilasters, the Victorian kind of paraphernalia of the architectural kind of imagery, and pulled it out across the road. So you see little bits of, you know, granite, lower parts of architecture, which then turned into a pub garden. So we made the footway into a pub garden by narrowing the carriageway a little bit and making the ground permeable. And then we thought it was quite nice to imagine that there were these ancient woodlands and the acorns had rolled down. You know, it's a slightly silly idea, but it means that you can wonder about bronze acorns and sit on them. And I'm pleased they haven't been stolen yet. I was worried, because they are bronze, you know, probably worth a bit. They're still there anyway, I think. Yeah, and reusing, you know, granite curbs. I noticed in Berlin walking around, there's an incredible amount of basalt and granite. It's really beautiful. And you know, similarly, you get curbs that they're often from Scotland. They used to be from Scotland, and then from Portugal, and then from China. So these are really old, and you know, they get chucked away when people dig streets up, and they're like antiques. So we try to reuse them in the parking bays. And here it's kind of interesting, you know, that this paving is the streetscape palette. We probably wouldn't choose these materials, but because we wanted to keep it cheap, keep the supply chain together for the local authority, we made a pattern out of materials which are readily available, and we could play with that. And that's leading you to the bus stop. I also wanted to just, let me see, what am I doing in my 12 minutes? It's not too bad. I can keep talking. Public space is right, and you know, you heard Alpa and Fiona talk about development and the processes by which, you know, whether it's local authority or whether it's more commercial developers, building, you know, sites get costed, development comes, and then somehow the public realm is a little bit difficult to remember because there's lots of other things going on, and you need a team of people to kind of keep the whole street and the buildings in view. And I think this is a good example of when that can work quite well, because what this is it's in Hackney, opposite the stadium. 250 homes, an affordable workspace building there, it's all work uses. Affordable rent building, that's the one we did. And then we did the whole of the public space around here, and Alford Hall Monaghan Morris did the rest of it. It was a nice collaboration, but also not just the design collaboration, there's also a very hands-on interest from the London Legacy Development Corporation, who were a little bit fed up of tall buildings, but also it was at the edge of conservation areas. So these are not tall, and at the same time, there had to be a kind of really strong public realm. So this drawing here was me trying to think about what was there materially. And so you have the kind of canal. The streets are in concrete, strangely, trees dotted around, and there are lots of little bell bollards. It's quite rough. It's quite got a kind of gritty working feel. And what we said was, okay, let's make a new street. So this is new, and this connects this street through to the canal, down to a public space. These are private gardens, private to the people living in these places. And that's the affordable rent building. And so I wanted to say a little bit about the way we thought about, because we're a funny practice doing public realm and buildings. You know, sometimes people think we're landscape architects, and then if we're doing buildings, they get kind of annoyed or confused. I don't care, you know, their problem. If we're going to try to kind of design cities, we need to all think together. We can all do lots of different things, and we need to put our heads together. So thinking about this kind of view with warehouse buildings, where there's something very beautiful about windows at different levels on two sides of a street, gives you a kind of funny feeling of things going on in place-specific ways. And so we said, okay, maybe we can use some of this. And so these ledges come into the elevation in different ways. So here, it's almost like you can sit on this one. And then there's 2 stories, so it makes the building seem a bit bigger. And then this one is lifted up, so you can drive under it and you can enter under it. So the building does 2 different things. Otherwise, it's like a warehouse block. And then at the top, you have this kind of, it's all very lower down. It's, you know, it's 4 sides, and you've got kind of views in all directions, and that's nice. Sorry, I should point to this one. That's the regular one. And then up here, it starts to ease up, and it starts to look around and turn into a star shape, so it kind of becomes softer. And I suppose we're thinking about this building because it looks in all directions. The site is totally amazing. This space next to the canal is good because the new bit, sorry, this doesn't really work. The new bit and the existing bit start to blur together. So on the left, you have the existing canal. On the right, this new space, this public space, making use of recycled materials. And there's a kind of interest in the paraphernalia of the canal, where the boats go up and down with little signs. So we said, okay, maybe we put the bollards at the top of the steps. We had to put some bollards in, so we made them behave in a particular way. But also the whole development had to retain these trees by pulling back. That was a big effort, but worth doing. This is the street that connects through. Here's the building. Next to it, there's a salmon fish factory. And so we made a salmon friendly gesture in our building, and then a salmon entrance at the ground floor. And on the corner, just down here, there's a commercial use, which gives it that kind of, I quite like the fact the commercial use has a different size window to everything else, and then there's a little substation in here which is funny sized doors, and then the rest is all residential. And that's how high streets are often like. People talk about wanting active frontages, but there's also something useful when you have doors and openings which seem to be doing something. You don't know what it is, but you know it's doing something. There's a play space at the back. So I think I've got just, oh yeah, okay. So I won't go over time, but I've got one more project to show you. Just going back to this thing of inscribing the name into the building. All the streets are named after fish. And it seemed very nice to bring this old name into the building and for it to kind of hold a sign. Instead of putting a sign on the building, it's kind of in the building. Yeah, this is an extract from our website. Please look at our website later on and commission us for lots of interesting projects in Berlin. I will be very ready for that. So I'm going to finish off with one last project. It's a project we worked on for many years. It's certainly to do with unfinishedness. It's still happening. One of the early things we did is we went walking. We had no work, actually, to be honest, and so we went walking. And I can recommend walking to find reasons to have a project. And this one here is in East London. You're on the top of Cleanaway, this big waste site. And we said, wouldn't it be nice to think about both sides of the river, not just being about waste and industry, but you could have a picnic then. Henri Cartier-Bresson's image is transposed into this view of the East London piece of the river. And then there's a few other chunks over the years that we looked at. And there were other designers. This is Peter Beard, kind of nice objects in this military, marshy landscape, which then became the RSPB. You have this Rainham Hall, very beautiful kind of building where goods used to be brought into the creek, and he would distribute those, and so he made a lot of money, and he kind of put Rainham on the map. And so we made these sort of drawings about time, distribution of assets, movement, the river, slow ways to walk through, industrial estates, you know, quite far from the high street, but not completely far, because it's all about moving through places. Peter Beard's long trackway with legs that lead you deep into the marshes. And coming back to this thing of intentions, of ideas, that this is how we won the project with our boiled wool model. We made a model of the marshes with golden thread in the boiled wool. So those are marshes, and that's the medieval village in the middle there. That's a sketch of a bit of the project at the edge of the river. Spaces we made next to the river, staircases. You know, this is Tilda Rice. This is kind of beautiful to be next to. Mini moments where you're up at a level, you can see the river, and then we make a concrete seat, which is made of rebars. And then taking people who had lived there for 40 or 50 years to visit their own village, make a little public space in the middle, make a monumental seat with Mark Pimlott, who's a great artist. Happens that it says east, but it also says east, west, north, south. That was kind of... and then also with, just coming to the end now, also with Mark Pimlott, we made a community garden, which was somehow called Railing Hall instead of Rainham Hall. It was kind of a joke, but it was nice because it would be it's like a building you can walk in and out of. It's almost like the dream of the high street is that it's permeable and always inviting you, and you can choose what to do there. Yeah, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julian. Thank you for taking us so far out east of London to Rainham Marshes. Incredibly interesting projects, and amazing to find these beautiful spaces in the outer city in areas we often neglect. I really cherish that. We are almost back in time, which I don't quite understand how it worked, but we have time for a short break now. We can go outside a little bit and take some fresh air. I think we take 15 minutes break, so at 6:30 we meet back here again. We have a discussion with all the speakers and with Elke Plate from the Berlin Senate Department. I'm also happy for you to prepare some questions if you wish, and then, yeah, we can enjoy the evening together. Yes. Yes, we had 4 wonderful presentations this afternoon, and now we're going to have a round of discussion, and we will also focus a little bit on Berlin. The international exchange between London and Berlin has been quite intense. It was one of the things Toby and I tried to do for a number of years, and yeah, so this is one more opportunity to have some shared thoughts, to think and look a bit into the future, and to see what both cities maybe can learn from each other. In order to get to know the situation of Berlin a little bit better for you guys, but also maybe to see for the audience what Berlin is doing in terms of city center regeneration, we have invited Elke Plate. Elke Plate studied spatial planning at the TU Dortmund, and she already founded an office during her studies. She then switched to public administration and has been working at the Senate Department for Urban Planning in Berlin for a long time. There she's responsible for a variety of strategic planning tasks at the citywide level, including the Berlin strategy or various urban development plans for the centers or also for business and industry. And also the post-corona project, which the Secretary of State mentioned earlier on, which is funded by the National Urban Development Policy, so national funding for the city of Berlin, which might be one point we will look at in the discussion, is where the German government is putting some money into best practice projects in Berlin, is also one of her tasks. And there she's looking at retail centers and the ground floor zones. So many points we have already heard in your presentations are reflected also in Elke's work, and I think that will be very interesting to hear what she's, her point of view from Berlin. And apart from that, Elke is also always involved in training and examination of junior urban planners who want to work in the government. Is that still correct? In the Städtebaureferendariat. So also this issue of bringing new talents into the municipality, she's also responsible for that in the city of Berlin. So Elke, I'm very glad to have you here in the afternoon, and you'll give us a quick presentation, and then we can have a discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Cordelia, for the kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for your patience with all the inputs. And thank you to Louise for the data, for Toby to bringing me to London, and Cordelia as well, for Fiona for the scale shift to the urban block, for Alpha for the short-term opportunities, and the diversity aspect, and for Julian for the teaspoon and walking, which I really love to do. Thank you. Well, I would like to highlight 3 challenges Berlin is faced to right now, despite the unclear consequences of the Russian war against the Ukraine. It's the demand for housing. We expect another population growth, and until 2030, there's a demand for 200,000 further housing units, which is a big challenge for the boroughs who are responsible for most of the plans which have to do with this. The second challenge is the decarbonization of the city, the economy, the mobility, the housing stock, to get more climate protection within settlement, development, and the adaptation to climate change, which is a big issue for public space. And when I saw the small trees in all the pictures from London, we can imagine how hard it will be for them to grow up to get big ones and support our livability cities. And the third challenge I would like to highlight is the forced structural change in the economy due to the digitalization, with impacts for retail centers and high streets. And this, in my opinion, causes a huge demand for integrated urban development strategies. The difficult trade-offs Berlin is facing is the financial situation of the public sector with a high debt burden, more than 15,000 euro per each inhabitant, a shortage of skilled workers in our offices, in the public sector, as well in some parts of the private sector, and a very challenging governance structure. Well, and with this in my mind, our Senate Secretary, she already mentioned our development plan on centers, and here you got an idea of the hierarchy. Ms. Radziwill already highlighted the aims which we focus with the urban development plan on the citywide level. These are 80 centers, and there are much more centers on the neighborhood level, which complete the center system of Berlin. So the idea is to secure the local supply and to qualify the polycentric structure as a backbone for a more environmental friendly mobility and development. Cordelia mentioned the urban development fundings by the federal state and the state of Berlin. And here, looking at the pink or violet signature, you see the program focusing on vibrant centers and neighborhoods. And you can see a couple of areas, about 20, where funding is spent. In the last year, in the program year of 2021, 42 million euros were spent in these areas to improve the public space and to involve people living in the environments in interaction to improve the centers. And, well, this is an example. It's an old mold house in Lichtenrade, and I would like to highlight this project because it's a good example for the multiple use and for its participation process. All people in the environment get involved. The library is located there, the VHS, a music school, and other public services. And as another example and important challenge we have, it's a conversation of shopping centers. We have about 60 shopping centers in Berlin. And here you could see phenomena you know from London as well, due to the increase of the land price markets and also due to the changes in retail development. We could observe that retail space isn't growing any longer, but it's shrinking, and in the city center it's shrinking more than in the city in total. We already heard something today about multifunctional commercial buildings, which are in the mainstream of real estate developments in Berlin as well. It's a new normal, I guess, and it's a sustainable answer to the challenges we have in our cities in common. This is a project Ms. Radziwill highlighted, the curated ground floor management. It's organized as a competition, initiatives from retail services and so on. They are asked to make concepts and to realize these concepts, and the idea after COVID is that there might be spaces like vacancy in retail shops which need new uses, or new uses seek a space. So we try to match both with the competition, addressing local networks, shop managers or owners, and people working in cultural affairs, people taking which are engaged in social associations and so on. It's a public-private partnership we do with the Chamber of Commerce and Industry in Berlin since 2005, and the new idea is to get the concepts realized by the people. And we have already seen pictures like this today. That's what we do. Markets are really important. Somebody highlighted markets as an important factor for reurbanization and revitalization of centers. That's what we have in common. Well, when we look at the center development, I think it's important to be more focused on the mix beyond retail and gastronomy, to look and use for the public space. Julian, you pointed out the qualities of Berlin in public space, for the public space as a backbone for the development, and the big issue of climate change adaptation in the public space. And we already had this to look for the people who want to do their business there and the people who live there, to get them together, because we can only build the centers when we three work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Elke. I would like to ask my guests from London. We have been talking a lot about retail today. And in Berlin, we do experience that retail is vanishing. We have a shift towards retail, which is focused on experience, rather than buying the everyday necessary stuff, because people tend to do that more and more online. And then that happened before the pandemic, and now in the pandemic, we all have been trained to do everything online. Like, we shop online, we spend our movie time online, we order our stuff from the restaurant online, and we have the feeling that this really changes the city, because it will lead to a diminishing of uses. Have you experienced the same in London? And do you see that there is empty ground floor uses, empty shops, and has that happened in a similar way?
I have to say, actually, not as much as you would expect in Waltham Forest. So there was obviously a slowdown in the use of retail spaces during COVID, but not as much as across the rest of London. And I think, actually, the bounce back has been supported by all that work that we did about active travel and pedestrian and cycle-friendly streets. So actually, the grain of retail across the borough and in places like Leytonstone High Street, which I focused on, has remained stronger than you might expect, actually. Yeah.
I mean, it would be useful if Louise could kind of, back us up with some statistics, because I've actually been asking myself, what is the London-wide picture of vacancy? Because my observation of it, and talking to, people in local authorities around London, is that it's actually not been this kind of hollowing out of high streets that has been expected. I think it's possibly worse in the very centre of London, possibly.
Okay.
But the local centres, some of them have done very well. I mean, I was down in Sutton, which was one of the places that Louise talked about in her presentation, which is quite far south in London. And that had a catastrophic, prior to COVID, hollowing out of retail. And the reason for the hollowing out of retail there was because, in fact, they had lost a lot of their commercial buildings. So in Sutton, there's a national policy that's been in place for maybe a decade now, called which is to do with permitted development. So one of the permitted development rights was to encourage the conversion of offices to residential, to create more residential, because the housing crisis. But the outcome, to anyone who could sort of sensibly see, was that a lot of really important office space, due to kind of land values being higher in residential at the time, meant that it was all lost. And that lost the kind of momentum and the footfall of the high streets. It wasn't just about people living there, it was about people living and working there, and the sort of complex interrelationship between the two of them. I mean, I imagine that COVID is going to have had it has had a fundamental impact on redistribution of the workforce as well. But places like Sutton, for example, these are places where a lot of people now are wanting to move to a bit more space and have workspace within that local town centre. And so they're seeing like some really positive changes. I don't know, I mean, when it comes to retail as well, I mean, I'm not a retail specialist, but I'm certainly aware that there's also the kind of the local services, the hairdressers, the nail bars, the things like this, which are they can only happen in person, and there's also quite a kind of resurgence for them as well.
I think I've become more aware of the complexity of what high streets are, and I think retail is quite an unhelpful word because it's a word that suggests sameness and a kind of system of activity, and I think if I agree with what's just been said. There's a kind of curious doubling back on. If you go to a number of high streets around the edges of London or outer parts of London, you start to see more vividly something that is about often local, often quite distinctive, often community used. The brands have sort of dropped away a bit. We have noticed that, and certainly in the centre, it's like it's all kind of mega charged uses, and they kind of pop or they stay. But high streets, which is what we're talking about, I think they get more and more interesting. So, for example, when there were the bombs in London, and everyone stopped going on in cars and buses.
In the 1990s.
In the 1990s, everyone started cycling down Old Street, let's say, and then this cycle shop popped up, and it's still going strong now. And I don't know if that was causal or if it was just funny timing, but it does reminds me of the resilience of local businesses and people collaborating to actually make something really interesting. Like there's a place quite near me, actually, in a parade. It was a newsagent, nothing much about it, but after COVID, I started noticing they'd changed their business. It's like plants were outside and they have talks. And then I noticed it was different people, and I thought, this is great. This is like how I want a newsagent to be. It's sort of other things. These spaces can be used flexibly. So I think we need a better word than retail.
In land use terms, it actually encapsulates all kinds of different ways of interacting, commerce, or including services. Like there's this sort of retail services as well, and I think there's a sort of, it needs a finer grained understanding.
Yeah.
Have you witnessed a change, Elke, in the different centres, also in the main touristic city centres?
I think it's similar to London, when there are no tourists, the middle of the city is quite empty. We have a photo from the Brandenburger Tor on March 17, when the first day of the lockdown happened. And right now we could observe that tourists are coming back. This Easter in 2022, there were more tourists in the city than Easter 2019. I guess that this will be similar to the development before. But what we could observe is a structural change in retail as well as in services. And as what you said about services is that the structural change there is quite hard, and we could observe a lot of vacancy in these uses, more even than in retail somehow. And so what we try to figure out with this post-corona project Cordelia already mentioned is what is the use, and we collect data for the first time in Berlin of uses which are not retail, to find out what will happen exactly. We will do this again in 2023, so that we could find out the differences in the uses, and then we could start to work with it. In Berlin, the boroughs are responsible for local center concepts, so these data are important for them to define strategies how to act with a vacancy. And what is also important is that that there are only very few people involved in these management processes, which we think I have in common, that there must be someone who is always taking care that the community work could go on.
Do you have these people in your projects? Like when you showed us like those placemaking or those master plans, and you have the designers like you who do this, and you have the people working at the local council. And is there some intermediate person who's talking to the retail owners, or who's talking to the people living there, or inviting the social workers in and stuff like that? Do you have that, or?
Yeah, it's quite active engagement. I mean, it depends on the project. I mean, I'm thinking some of the other kinds of projects which are to do with industrial uses along that western boundary that I mentioned, along the river, where we've got lots of industrial space. We've done a lot of engagement with landowners there. That's during the inception phase of the project, but continues all the way through. And as part of our team as well, we have an engagement officer as well, so there's also community engagement as well. But you know, community engagement is kind of a thing that happens at certain points in a project, and what we're trying to do more is think of it as a process that continues through the whole project. So it's not one discrete thing that happens once, but also that there's the feedback as well. So you engage, and then you do more work, and then you take it back again. So that is, as part of that restructure that I talked about, that's something that we are very much embedded. Yeah.
I think it's also about proximities. For example, recently there's been a resurgence of an interest in looking at London's railway arches, which of course has synchronicity with high streets in many ways. And one of the things about the railway arches is that they have historically been lower rent because they're less obviously able to be used for various things. So there's kind of car repair, they've got a yard, there's a certain kind of space to them, which means that they're used in certain ways. And of course, what's starting to happen is that that's there's a new layer of other types of uses, you know, art gallery or community restaurant or something like that. And what I think is really interesting is not losing the car repair, but juxtaposing them in a way where you start to get this kind of urbanity of the proximity of unlike uses, giving that thing that people like in cities when there's something surprising next to each other. And I think that is, your question is about people who, know about business and, economics. There are some very good consultants who have kind of got they know through experience what works, what doesn't work. And I think they're sometimes relying on, sometimes they're not just relying on the figures, but they're showing examples of where things work, and you have to wonder why they're working, but you like it. So I think there's a lot of things that could be done to not just put uses in, but to think about combinations of uses. And as Alpa pointed out earlier, you can make a street pedestrianised to some extent, and then the businesses don't close down, they thrive, because there's footfall there. And it's quite unpredictable consequences sometimes.
I think that's a really useful point. And in a way, when you have existing high streets or sort of mixed-use places, whether it's high streets or arches, you can conceive of these quite different uses adjacent to each other. And what's interesting about the way they work is that there are a kind of layered sort of spatial and visual cues about how people can and should behave, in that space. Whether, in town centres we often have nurseries, for instance, like with small kids, and there's lots of ways that can be made private and have a more public face at the entrance. But cities have evolved over time to make it quite kind of clear the sort of level of decorum and to kind of negotiate those quite conflicting uses. But what's quite difficult is when you have a big new development and the sort of having the imagination to be able and the language to describe how certain things can coexist. It's quite a task. I mean, it's a task that I think we're all sort of setting ourselves, but aware as well of the mechanisms by which those new spaces are delivered, and whether or not those either financial or mostly financial mechanisms can deal with levels of uncertainty.
But it's also, I think it's interesting that you showed some of these meanwhile uses which were meant to last 3 months and lasted 10 years. It does make me think that part of this is time. that actually when you have a business plan, you have a vision, you want to make something happen, you put some money into it, it's very good to think about that leading on to other things, and maybe we have to think about shorter visions, and the longer term thing is a more complex kind of outcome, because we can only control so much for so much time. And
it was interesting that some of the earlier work that we did on high streets was quite expressly about trying to protect those spaces, because there wasn't, a lot of them were not within policy boundaries, so they were just kind of outside, you know, they were sort of unregulated, should we say. And it was quite easy to, you know, if someone wanted to argue that this isn't needed. We can turn it into, you know, we can turn it into housing. And I think the concern was that once that happens, it will never go back. It's a one-way street. And I mean, I think we all accept that there does need to be some sort of shifting and changing, and it's not as if these things are set in stone. But it's really useful to talk about having the data, because to have, you know, to have those sort of facts available to kind of defend something that may not be in use now, but in a year's time or 5 years' time, it may be imperative to have the flexibility to have different types of uses that aren't just residential. But yeah.
Do you want to, like, also protecting like small businesses and the car repair place and stuff like that is also a key issue to your work? And
yeah, it's a task of different development plans which we address to secure in the city, and there are different tasks. I would come back to another point. You mentioned the temporary uses, and to try to make some experiments. What we could observe and what was forced by the pandemic was the increase of people using bikes because they tried to avoid the public transport. And we had this very successful story, I guess, with the implementing of pop-up lanes. And right now in this summer we could observe that more parking spaces are used by pubs or restaurants or just for play. So this is an ongoing process which got a big impact from the experience of public space during the COVID period, the lockdowns. And I guess you have similar experience in London.
Yeah, I think parking and cars is such, you know, everyone knows how divisive that is and how angry people get when you're restricting their access with cars. That's a big problem quite often in London. And you know, you have the most unbelievably wide roads here in Berlin, so there's a kind of, I mean, the traffic engineers really got everything they wanted, it seems to me, in terms of the lane widths. But I do think there's a big opportunity there with roads, with the perception of cars. I mean, you know, if you think of what's going to happen with cars, they're going to become electric, then become much quieter. They might start turning into something that's more socially acceptable. And roads can get smaller and spaces can get bigger. There was an interesting thing that happened in Soho in London when they got rid of all the cars, and no one really liked it. It didn't really work. So they got the cars back again, funnily enough, because somehow the cars gave some of the vitality. But that's because it was where it was. That wouldn't be the same around, in Waltham Forest, where that wouldn't have the same effect, because there's a different feeling about it. So it's about being place-specific. I do think that there is something that we have to acknowledge, that cars are here to stay, and we have to just relegate them, we have to balance them, and we have to kind of somehow find a way of mediating or mixing it into the bigger public realm. And I think it's how you think about it, you know, how fast you have to go, how long do you have to park, car clubs. I mean, I think you probably do this probably better than we do in many ways, because you're used to that. But I do think there's a kind of so, for example, I went to see this car repair place, which was going to become a housing site, And it was so beautiful because all the cars suddenly looked like boats when you see them by the sea. You know, they're all colourful, people are mending them. It's like you could sit and have a coffee and just watch people mend cars. It was like a spectacle. And I was thinking, why can't that be like the main attraction, you know, and you can build some housing and keep them. So I don't know, it's, you know, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and I think we can incorporate cars.
But it's really about creating unique situations and not the generic stuff which you find in big shopping malls or which you can then also find on the internet maybe, but to create urban situations which have incorporate unthinkable uses
But the car thing is really interesting in Waltham Forest, because in some ways we've really won the argument of like taking cars off the street. So all of our development is car-free in the south of the borough, not in the north of the borough, where it's, you know, having a car is a human right. So all our developments in the south are car-free, but then there are other unintended consequences. So, you know, on the larger developments, there's a lot of deliveries and people doing, you know, online shopping and all this. So that has to be considered as part of the public realm design for these larger housing schemes as well. Like where do all these vans and things go, and where do they stop, and you know, Ubers and drop off and all that. So it's another unintended consequence of eliminating cars. Well, we still have them around the development, just not personal cars. Yeah.
I guess the cars are not our solution. They are more a challenge. And in Berlin, most people who do shopping or drive for make travels, journeys, trips for services. They do not use the car. Only 27% do it by car. The rest is doing it on feet or by bike or with public transport. So I guess it's important to foster this.
But it's interesting because there's still a lot of cars, right? People have cars but they don't necessarily use them. Yeah. Which is because there's a difference. Because car storage
car storage is a problem.
Phenomenal.
And it's the question why it should be in public space.
Yeah, no, but I think COVID has, to some extent, invited people to question just literally geometrically the amount of space that vehicles are allowed to take up.
Yeah, that is also a key component of many of the other post-corona projects which we are looking at. Many of them, also the one Toby is conducting in Hamburg now, is trying to free up public space which was used by cars for pedestrians and for other kind of uses, and to do that also in the city centers and create more possibilities, opportunities for street parties or gatherings or concerts. In Berlin, we had this quite good program of outside concerts last summer to revive the cultural scene, and of course that can only take place if there is a big enough public space.
We're doing a project at the moment in Camden, which is a street with a market in it and cars parked there. And what we're trying to do, it's quite funny because we're trying to make the curb go into like a wiggly cloud sort of shape. So it's completely unclear. But of course, we can't really do that. So there's a line that goes through within it, which is the curb.
Because of the parking
Because of
rules.
the parking,
yes,
and people don't want cars kind of driving over, knocking people over. So there's, it's very strange. It's going to at least make car drivers think twice. That's really going to be the outcome. And it changes the image. It changes your expectation. So at least you have to kind of look harder.
I would like to know how the projects that you're doing are being funded, and some of them look quite well funded, but of course we all know there's scarcity in public resources. So how do the municipalities create the money? Which kind of sources do they get them from?
Alpa can probably speak to this most.
Well, you know, there's central government funding for some of the house building that we're doing, because local authorities are now taking more of a proactive, you know, stance on producing housing.
Okay, so the housing itself is paid for by sometimes.
So there's some central government funding for that, but really all of the small scale stuff that you see is all through developer contributions. So pretty much everything in terms of public realm or some of those meanwhile projects or whatever has to be delivered through, well, will be paid for by developer contributions from a larger scale development.
The developer has to pay something when he gets the planning application, or?
Yeah, so there are certain levies. There's Section 106, which will pay for certain community infrastructure. There's SILS, the community infrastructure levy. There's also the mayor's levy. We also have in the borough another separate thing which is to do with Epping Forest. So there's a levy that developers have to pay because that forest that I mentioned, which is to the top and to the east, that's owned by the City of London, and development in the borough, the growth, will put stress on the forest. So there's a levy to do with that as well, and mitigation of impact on that. So that's another levy that we can use for public realm.
But this levy will also be paid for by the developers.
Yes.
Okay. So and then is there a motivation for the developers to ask for higher densities in order to pay for these?
Yes. And the affordable provision is all cross-subsidised by the development. So the conversation that we always have with pre-app discussions is always about the amount of affordable housing or these other things that you're going to get, and the balance of density and so on, because, well, if you are opposed to this amount of height and density, it means you won't have
the money. Yeah, interesting.
But affordable housing is always the point of contention.
And there's no London-wide funding programs or national funding programs, for example, the mitigation of climate change, or to foster and promote the mobility turnaround, or these kind of things?
There are always smaller pots. So there's lots of pots that come from the GLA, and as you know, because you will have worked on these projects that are funded by the GLA, but most of the stuff is through developer contributions.
That is very interesting for us to hear, I assume, Elke, right? Is there any such thing, just very seldomly in Germany, right?
For
developer contribution, also das in the städtebauliche Vertrag,
yeah,
right?
Sure, and it's quite common. With regard to the housing demand in Berlin, when there's a Bebauungsplan needed, and you have more than 5,000 square meters of housing, then you have the same idea and construction that the developers are involved. And the idea is to have 30% affordable housing in these areas. Affordable means, I guess, €6.50 a square meter. And, well, then it's a development, yeah.
But it is significant that almost all of the infrastructure has to be delivered by the returns from the developments. And it is one of the reasons why we're seeing the scale that we're getting. But local authorities who would otherwise be building health centres and schools have had their funding cut by enormous amounts in the last 10 years.
Yeah, because of the 10 years between 2010 to 2020, it's 60p in the pound has been lost. From So the scale of the cuts, it can't be overstated.
So it's really underfunded.
It's a political austerity. It's a political issue.
And also an interest in leaving development up to the market as a kind of national view.
I would like to look into the audience if there is any questions to our speakers. Yeah. Maybe you could quickly introduce your name and.
My name is Perek. I'm a city planner, and I would like to focus in this one thing which is called partnership. In the 90s, we had a development, so-called business improvement districts, BIDs. And I would like to hear something about that. What about landlords and private ownership? How can you organize them that they put some money together and then that they make their own goals to achieve things in areas, in high streets, where there is no development? Yes, we have also to recognize that there are a lot of high streets where a development is not so possible. And what about this old idea, it's from the 90s, to organize owners and so on. bring initiatives together from landlords.
Thank you. Somebody like to?
Yeah. I mean, we don't have any bids in Waltham Forest, but there are in other parts of London. I think in Westminster there's some quite strong bids, and in like in Vauxhall there are a few as well. I think the position that we would take as a local authority is that with this area-based work that we are doing, we would like to set the ambition for the area and consult with landowners and business owners about what things could happen. So we would like to engage, but I think we wouldn't want to cede that responsibility, perhaps. I think we would prefer to have control over guiding what comes forward.
There are some very successful bids in London, though, but there are other sort of layers. There's other kinds of trader associations that aren't quite bids, because there's quite a formal structure for a business improvement district, and it takes, it takes quite a lot of investment to start it, to actually start it. There's one in Southwark that commissions. That has, funding and commissions work. We've done, and they work very closely with Southwark Council. But I think that there are others where they're not quite bids, but they're quite strong traders associations. Have you worked in Peckham were you working in Peckham where there's quite...
Not with the bid, no.
Is there a bid there, or is it just a traders association? But I think that there was some implication that it was quite biased. It was quite easy for it to be quite biased to sort of some larger businesses, and it was quite difficult to make it equitable.
Is it easy for you or difficult to get in touch with the property owners if it's like international companies and stuff like that?
Difficult.
Yeah.
There's a lot of absentee landlords, historic, that don't have any real interest.
Do you see that in Berlin too, Elke?
I'm not really involved in these detailed topics, so I'm not sure about how difficult it might be. We have 2 business improvement districts in Berlin, and they, as you mentioned, it's a really big effort to get it started, and it's a big effort for the administration due to all the owners who are going to court and try to negotiate again about what's going on in the business plans. So it's not easy to deal with, and right now we have the situation that we can't follow with the law, with the existing law, due to some regulations by the federal court regarding tax policy. So it's right now it's in the middle of everything and not usable.
But in terms of, without having to necessarily incorporate a business improvement district, the point of getting groups together to define a shared mission and sort of communicate to collective identity is I think quite a strong part of the sort of mayoral objectives.
I think it's a really good question, actually, because it makes you think, well, surely if people want to get together, then why shouldn't they, and how can they be supported? But I think what tends to happen is that it's like Alpa's suggesting, that there needs to be a kind of an idea or a picture of how improvements can not only benefit individual businesses, but because they're in a high street, let's say, you have the private businesses, then you have maybe some local authority-owned footway, and then you have some Transport for London-owned footway. There needs to be someone, and the GLA is obviously able to kind of countenance this whole picture to some extent, or local authorities could push the whole picture. It's like someone needs to lead an idea so that everyone chips in a bit of money. And so there does need to be projects identified which are costed, visions, people consulted, discussed, and then that can happen. But just because you want to make it integrated with the city rather than just sit happily over to one side, I think that's the challenge. So it's the timing and it's the sequencing, and it is complex.
I would like to ask you all a final question. What would be your wishes for high streets or city centers in the future, in a time where we see that everything is changing, retail is changing, climate is changing, transport is changing? what are you hoping for? What will high streets, city centers be like in the future, in maybe 10 years? What kind of places are they?
I think my biggest hope would be in London for trees and fresher air, cleaner air. And I think that that's fundamental to wanting to be in a place. You know, not just cleaner air, but the sound. So a lot of our high streets are quite vehicle dominated, and it's hostile. You know, it's not good for the senses. And some of the places we've been here for such a short time. I wish I could stay longer. But some of the places we saw on our walk around, I mean, I commented, you can hear the birds singing everywhere, or not, maybe not everywhere, almost everywhere. I don't hear the birds singing in London very much. And so I think that would be my biggest hope, would be more and bigger trees and plants and an appreciation that is worth more than the things you would have to give up.
I was thinking during COVID that in the last pandemic, in the kind of 19th century, parks were built in London because of, you know, the situation. And so I've got two versions of an answer for this. The first version is make 11 new parks for London. Of course, that's great. Thank you very much. But it would be kind of cool. And I was wondering whether the high streets could be the parks, so similar to what Fiona's saying. And then I was thinking, where do we go when we want to go somewhere? You know, you go to a gallery, you go to a museum, you go to a park. Why can't we go to a high street? And why? Because you don't go to high streets. You sort of do shopping, you drive down it, you go along in a bus. But to make them destinations seems possible, given the kind of nature of the discussion we've been having. So they turn into kind of proto-parks, if you like, in terms of their social opportunity. Much greener. The spaces at the backs of the buildings can be, I think there could be something interesting about sharing land, rationalizing yards, making them productive. There's often lots of scrappy spaces, green spaces, underused spaces, and massively complicated because they're all separately owned, but they could connect to the front, and then you would have a deeper high street function. So yeah, visit the high street.
Elke, and then...
Well, 3 points. More climate adaptation in the street, so another handling with water and green, and high streets with no obligation to consume. So I think it's important, and to have the possibility to observe science, manufacturing, and people.
I mean, absolutely clean air, but I think that they remain messy, that high streets just remain kind of disordered and kind of disorganized, and in a way that the work that we're doing is not done, because we don't want homogeneous high streets, so, you know, that they remain kind of full of life and active. And actually, I do think some of them are destinations. I mean, my local high street, Chatsworth Road, you will see characters there that just go there to just sit on a bench and just hang out for a day. You always see the same kind of people. So I think that stays, that the idea that you go there so that you can kind of observe people and just hang out and you don't have to consume, that remains. So that's what I would hope for.
These visions are pretty similar, or at least they link up very well with each other, and that makes me quite happy. It would be a vision I would also share. Yeah, this is a brilliant end to this evening, I would say. I would like to thank you very much. I would like to thank IV and the Unvollendete Metropolen exhibition very, very much, that we had the opportunity to have you here and have this wonderful talks and discussion. I would like to thank again Toby and Louise. I hope they can still hear us, and I wish you all a safe journey back home and a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.